Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'm not sure why I'm finally writing this down after all these years. Maybe because I can't sleep tonight, and I keep thinking about it. Maybe because my therapist says I need to process what happened instead of just pushing it away. Whatever the reason, here goes. This happened about 7 years ago. I was going through an absolutely brutal divorce with my ex, Sarah. It was the kind where you wake up every morning with this pit in your stomach, wondering what new hell the day would bring. Another email from her lawyer, another fight about the house, another accusation. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep, was drinking too much. My buddy Chris could see I was falling apart and offered me his family's cabin in the Olympic National Forest. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors for miles, he said. Just you and the trees, man. Get your head straight. It sounded perfect. I needed to get away from everything. The divorce papers, the constant texts, all of it. I packed up my Subaru with enough food for a week, some books I'd been meaning to read, and my Winchester rifle. Not that I planned on hunting, but Chris had mentioned there were black bears and cougars in the area, better safe than sorry. The cabin was even more isolated than Chris had described. I had to follow his hand-drawn map down a series of unmarked forest service roads that got progressively narrower until I was basically driving on a glorified trail. The cabin itself was simple, one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a bathroom with a composting toilet, and a loft bedroom accessible by ladder. Solar panels provided minimal electricity, and there was a hand pump for water from a well. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I hiked during the day, read by oil lamp at night, and felt my stress levels dropping by the hour. No phone calls, no emails, no reminders of the life that was falling apart back in Seattle. Just me, the forest, and blessed silence. On the third night, everything changed. I'd gone to bed around 10 after finishing a few chapters of my book. Must have been around midnight when I woke up to a sound outside. It took me a moment to identify what I was hearing. The distinct snap of sticks breaking. Not the random sounds of forest animals moving around, but rhythmic breaks like something large was deliberately stepping on branches. Snap, pause, snap, pause, snap. Each break sounded closer to the cabin than the last. I sat up in bed, fully awake now. My first thought was bear, but the pattern seemed too deliberate. Bears don't walk with that kind of rhythm. I reached for the flashlight I kept by the bed, but hesitated before turning it on. Some instinct told me to remain still and silent. The snapping continued, circling around toward the back of the cabin, then stopped abruptly. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening, but heard nothing more. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, telling myself it was probably just a deer or elk. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee, intending to check around the cabin. The air was cool and damp, typical for the Pacific Northwest in autumn. I walked around to the back, where the woodpile was stacked against the cabin wall. That's when I saw them, footprints in the soft earth behind the woodpile, but not animal prints. They looked like bare human feet, enormous bare human feet. I placed my boot next to one for comparison, and it was nearly twice the length of my size 11. The imprint was deep, suggesting whatever made it was heavy. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I tried telling myself it was just a weird bear print, distorted by the rain or something, but I couldn't make that explanation stick. Bears don't have 5 toes with a distinct arch and heel. I decided to take a hike to clear my head. There was an old logging road about a quarter mile from the cabin that made for easy walking. I brought my rifle, which I hadn't planned to do on previous hikes. About a mile down the road, I noticed something odd. A young cedar sapling, maybe 8 feet tall, had been broken about halfway up, then twisted and bent in a way that didn't look natural. The break wasn't clean like it would be if it had snapped in a windstorm. It looked like something had deliberately twisted it, and the forest was quiet. Too quiet. Usually you hear birds, squirrels, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But there was nothing. Just a heavy silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I turned back toward the cabin, walking faster than I had on the way out. The whole time, I had this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but never saw anything. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon trying to read, but couldn't focus. I kept looking out the windows, checking and rechecking that the door was locked. It started raining around 4, a steady drizzle that would normally sound peaceful drumming against the roof. Instead, it just amplified my isolation. As dusk fell, I lit the oil lamp and made a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. I was eating at the small table when it started. Thud. Something hit the cabin wall, not hard, but deliberate. Then another thud, and another, like someone was throwing small rocks or pine cones against the siding. I set down my spoon and listened. The sounds moved along the wall, following the perimeter of the cabin. Then I heard a new sound, a slow, dragging noise against the wooden boards, like someone running their hand, or paw, along the wall as they walked. The dragging stopped at the front of the cabin. There was a long pause where all I could hear was the rain and my own breathing. Then, and this is what really froze me in place, 3 loud, deliberate knocks on the front window. Knock, knock, knock. Perfectly spaced, like someone wanting to be let in. I switched off the oil lamp immediately, plunging the cabin into darkness. I stood there, barely breathing, my heart hammering so loud I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. Heavy, shuffling sounds moved away from the window, around the corner of the cabin, and then seemed to retreat toward the tree line. I remained standing in the dark for at least an hour before I dared move. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in a chair facing the door, rifle across my lap, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, every rustle outside. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a curious bear, or even a person playing a sick joke. But deep down, I knew it was something else. At first light, I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the ground soft and muddy, and there they were again, those same massive footprints. 5 distinct prints led from the front window along the wall, then headed off toward the forest. They were clearly foot-shaped, with 5 toes, an arch and a heel. The stride length was enormous, easily 7 feet between prints. That's when I knew. As crazy as it sounds, I was convinced I was dealing with a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, and it had been circling my cabin, watching me, trying to intimidate me. I started packing immediately. No coffee, no breakfast. I threw my stuff into my bags haphazardly, not caring about organization. All I wanted was to get out of there and back to civilization. I loaded up the Subaru and locked the cabin according to Chris's instructions. The forest still had that unnatural silence as I started down the dirt road. I'd gone maybe half a mile when I rounded a bend and saw it. A young fir tree, about 20 feet tall, pushed across the road. It hadn't been there the day before when I'd hiked this way. The tree hadn't fallen naturally. It looked like it had been deliberately uprooted and placed there as a barricade. I sat in my car, engine idling, staring at this obstacle. Going around wasn't an option. The road was narrow with steep ditches on either side. I'd have to move it. I had a tow strap in my emergency kit, so I got out, moving quickly, constantly scanning the tree line around me. The entire time I worked to secure the strap and drag the tree just enough to create a gap I could drive through, I felt watched. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. I knew something was in the trees, observing me, maybe 50 yards away. I never saw it directly, just caught movements in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look. It took 20 minutes to clear enough space to squeeze the Subaru through. Those were the longest 20 minutes of my life. I never turned my back to the forest, and I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder the whole time. Once I got through, I drove like hell, not slowing down until I hit pavement 2 hours later. I stopped at the first gas station I found and just sat in the parking lot, shaking, trying to process what had happened. I never told anyone about this for years, not even Chris. I made up some excuse about why I left early. I was afraid people would think I was crazy or making it up, but a couple years later, I was having beers with an older guy who'd worked as a forest ranger in that area. Without mentioning my experience, I casually asked if he'd ever heard any strange stories about that section of the Olympic forest. He got real quiet, then told me the local tribes had old stories about a hairy forest giant that watches lone people and tries to scare them away from certain areas. Said there had been reports from hikers and campers over the years, strange noises, broken trees, footprints. Most people laughed it off as folklore or misidentified bears. But this ranger, he didn't laugh. He just said, "The forest keeps its secrets." I know what I experienced. I know what I saw and heard. Something intelligent wanted me gone from that cabin, from its territory. And it used tactics, intimidation, blocking my escape route that no animal would think of. I've gone camping and hiking many times since then, but never alone, never again in a place that remote, and never without making sure I have cell service. Some nights, like tonight, when I'm lying in bed and can't sleep, I still hear those 3 deliberate knocks on the window, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door. Story 2. I've been debating whether to post this for months. I'm still not sure if I should, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. What happened that night in the woods behind our house in Ashland has been eating away at me for years. I'm 21 now, but I was 13 when it happened, and it changed everything about my life. I've always been obsessed with nature and wildlife. My parents used to joke that I was born in the wrong century, that I should have been some kind of wilderness explorer. Our house in Oregon backed up to this huge stretch of forest, and I spent pretty much every free moment out there collecting bugs, identifying birds, or just sitting quietly watching deer. My collection of field guides was my most prized possession. This all started one Saturday in April when I was out collecting caterpillars for a school project. I'd wandered further than usual, maybe a mile or so from our property line, when I found something that stopped me in my tracks. At first, I thought someone was playing a prank. There in the soft mud near a creek bed was a footprint. Not just any footprint, this thing was huge, like 15 inches long at least. It looked human-shaped, but way too big to be a person. I'm not stupid. I immediately thought Bigfoot, but also knew that wasn't really possible. So I figured maybe some local guys made a fake foot to mess with people. But then I found another print, and another. A whole trail of them, each one perfectly pressed into the soil with what looked like 5 toes. They were deep too, like whatever made them was really heavy. I took some pictures with my phone and ran all the way home, bursting through the door yelling for my dad. He's always been the practical one in the family, an engineer who needs proof for everything. When I showed him the pictures, he just laughed and said, "Shannon, someone's playing tricks. Probably those boys from the Miller family." But I knew what I saw. Those prints weren't fake. I could tell from how the mud compressed around the edges, how the toes left individual impressions. No homemade stomper could do that. For weeks after, I begged my parents to let me set up a trail camera. Mom eventually gave in, but Dad said it was a waste of money. My birthday was coming up in May, and I had one request: night vision goggles. Not the cheap toy ones, but real ones. To my surprise, they actually got them for me, probably thinking I'd use them a few times and get bored. They had no idea how wrong they were. I started camping out near our property line maybe 2 or 3 nights a week. My parents were cool with it since I was still technically in our backyard, just at the edge where the forest started. I'd set up my little one-person tent, bundle up in my sleeping bag, and watch the woods through my goggles until I fell asleep. For almost 2 months, nothing happened. Just raccoons, the occasional deer, nothing exciting. Then came that night in July. The weather had been really hot all week, and the evening was sticky and uncomfortable. I remember being annoyed by mosquitoes and almost packing up to go back to the house around 11 o'clock. Thank God I didn't. I was lying on my stomach at the tent entrance, scanning the tree line with my goggles, when I saw movement about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was a bear. We occasionally got black bears in the area, and I was prepared to retreat if needed. But as I focused, I realized it wasn't a bear at all. There were 2 figures moving between the trees. In the greenish glow of the night vision, I could make out that they were walking upright like humans. But something was wrong. They were tall, way too tall. One of them had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. Their proportions were all off too. Their arms hung down almost to their knees, and their heads seemed to sit directly on their shoulders without much of a neck. I remember my whole body going cold, despite the July heat. I couldn't move or scream or anything. I just watched them through the goggles, praying they wouldn't come any closer. The taller one stopped and seemed to be sniffing the air. The other one, which was maybe 6.5 feet tall, dropped down onto all 4s. It wasn't like how a person would crawl. It was fluid, natural, like that was a normal way for it to move. And then it started circling toward my tent. I don't know how they didn't hear my heart pounding. It was so loud in my ears I was sure it would give me away. The one on all 4s got to within maybe 20 yards of my tent and stopped. It raised its head and seemed to stare right at me. I couldn't see its face clearly through the goggles, just a dark mass where features should be. Then I heard it. Deep, rhythmic breathing. Not like a person panting, but slow, deliberate breaths that seemed to fill the entire space between us. It was smelling me, testing my scent on the air. My hands started shaking so bad that I dropped the goggles. They fell with a small thud on the tent floor. I froze, not daring to move to pick them up. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I just lay there in the dark, listening to the breathing get closer and closer, until it was right outside my tent. The fabric of the tent wall moved slightly, like something was almost touching it, but not quite. I could feel the warmth of its breath through the nylon. I had my face pressed into my sleeping bag, trying not to make a sound. That's when I heard them communicating. At first, it sounded like men talking in some foreign language, guttural sounds with structure but not any words I recognized. Then it changed, morphing into these animal-like grunts and clicks. It wasn't random noise. They were talking to each other. The one near my tent made a series of low vocalizations, and the one still standing by the trees answered back. Then the craziest thing happened. From somewhere deeper in the forest came a sound I'll never forget. A perfect imitation of a woman crying, just sobbing her heart out. It was so real, so human, that for a second I thought maybe there was actually someone lost in the woods. But then the one near my tent replied with the same exact crying sound, like it was mimicking or mocking. That's when I understood. They could copy any sound they heard. They were using sounds they'd heard from humans to communicate with each other. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually the breathing moved away from my tent. When I finally got the courage to peek out and retrieve my goggles, both creatures were gone. I waited until first light, then bolted back to the house. My parents didn't believe me, of course. Mom thought I'd had a nightmare, and Dad said I was letting my imagination run wild. Probably just some homeless guys camping in the woods, he said. Stay away from the forest edge for a while. I tried to go back to normal life, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside my window made me jump. I kept the goggles by my bed and would sometimes watch the tree line from my bedroom window at night. 1 week after the incident, I saw one of them again. It was standing at the very edge of our property, half hidden behind a large pine tree, just watching our house. I ran to get my dad, dragging him to the window and pointing frantically. "There's someone out there," he said, squinting into the darkness. "Stay here." Before I could stop him, he grabbed a flashlight and his baseball bat and headed outside. I was screaming at him not to go, but he thought they were human trespassers. Mom came running to see what the commotion was about, just as the most horrible sound erupted from the woods. It was like multiple women screaming at once, high-pitched, terrified screams like they were being stabbed or tortured. But there was something wrong with the sound, like it was being played through a broken speaker. It rose and fell in impossible ways. No human could scream like that without taking a breath. Mom ran outside too, and I followed her to the back porch. Dad was frozen in the yard, his flashlight beam pointed at the trees. When Mum saw whatever was there, she screamed too. A real human scream of genuine terror. I finally got the courage to look where they were looking. The creatures were standing in full view now. In the flashlight beam, I could see dark, shaggy hair covering their bodies. Their faces were almost human, but wrong. The eyes set too far apart, no real nose to speak of, just nostrils in a flat face. Their mouths were wide and lipless. Dad backed toward the house slowly, keeping the light on them. "Get inside," he whispered. "Call the police." I ran to the phone and dialed 911, babbling to the operator about monsters in our yard. By the time the police arrived, the creatures had retreated deeper into the forest, but they were still visible with my night vision goggles. 2 officers took them and looked where I pointed. "Yeah, we see them," one officer said, handing the goggles back to me, "but they appear to be off your property now, sir." He was talking to my dad in this weird formal way, like he was reciting something. "What are they?" Dad asked, his voice shaking. The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "Probably just some wildlife, sir. Bears can stand on their hind legs, you know." But the way he said it, I knew he was lying. These cops knew exactly what we'd seen, and they weren't surprised at all. We didn't see the creatures again after that night, but things were never the same. Mom started keeping all the curtains closed. Dad installed security lights all around the house. I never went into those woods again. A year later, we moved to Colorado. My parents never said it was because of what happened, but I knew. We all knew. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those breathing sounds outside my tent, about those not quite human faces. I've researched Bigfoot sightings for years now, trying to make sense of what we saw. But nothing quite matches our experience. These weren't gentle forest giants. They were predators, intelligent ones. And the scariest part? I think they're still out there, in those woods behind our old house, watching and waiting and learning to mimic us even better. Story 3. I've never really shared this experience with many people. It happened back in the fall of 2004, and to this day I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My ex-husband and I had planned a hunting trip near Kennard in East Texas. His stepfather owned some property that bordered the Davy Crockett National Forest, and we'd been there several times before without incident. It was early November, that perfect time when the leaves are changing and there's a slight chill in the air. We arrived mid-afternoon on a Friday. The plan was for my ex to go hunting before dusk while I stayed back at the car. I wasn't much into hunting myself, but I enjoyed the outdoors and had brought a book to read. The clearing where we parked was about half a mile from the main road, accessible only by a narrow dirt path. It was a decent-sized open area surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides, with a field stretching out on the 4th. The field had this one lone pine tree standing maybe 100 yards away. I remember it distinctly because it looked so odd and solitary out there. My ex grabbed his rifle and gear, gave me a quick kiss, and headed off into the woods. "Be back before dark," I called after him. He waved without turning around. I settled into the passenger seat with my paperback, occasionally glancing up at the scenery. It was peaceful, just the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As the afternoon wore on, the light started to fade, casting long shadows across the field. I remember checking my watch. It was around 5:30, and the sun would be setting soon. That's when I first heard it. What sounded like children laughing in the distance. It wasn't loud, just faint giggles carried on the breeze. I sat up straight, listening hard. We were pretty far from any houses or campgrounds, so hearing children out here was strange. The sounds came and went, and I figured maybe there were other hunters nearby with their families. I went back to my book, but found myself straining to hear those sounds again. There was something off about them, not quite right. The laughter didn't sound normal. It was higher pitched than I'd expect, with this weird cadence to it. The light was fading fast now, and I was starting to worry about my ex. He knew these woods well, but still, just as I was considering honking the horn, I saw him emerging from the tree line at a brisk pace. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong. He wasn't walking normally, more like speed walking while constantly looking over his shoulder. When he reached the car, his face was pale, and he was breathing hard. He yanked open the driver's side door and jumped in. "Roll up your window," he said, not even looking at me as he started the engine. "What's wrong? What happened?" I asked, quickly rolling up my window. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the field, toward that lone pine tree. "Look over there," he whispered. "Do you see them?" I followed his gaze, squinting in the dimming light. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then movement caught my eye. Around the base of that solitary pine tree, something was moving. No, not something. Some things. Plural. There were two, I don't even know what to call them. Creatures, beings. They were moving in this strange, fluid way around the tree. One of them moved behind the trunk and then reappeared on the other side, crouching low so that just its head was visible. Even from that distance, maybe 100 yards, I could tell it was massive. It had these incredibly broad shoulders and long arms that seemed disproportionate to its body. The thing was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, not like a costume, but like actual hair growing from its skin. The strangest part was its head. It sat low on those broad shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck, and it was staring directly at us, not moving, not flinching, just watching. The second creature remained partially hidden on the far side of the tree. I could only make out parts of it, an arm, a shoulder, occasionally what might have been the top of its head, but it seemed similar to the first one. What I felt in that moment wasn't just regular fear, it was this deep, primal dread that settled into my bones. My mouth went completely dry, and I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. It was like my brain was screaming danger without really understanding why. "What are they?" I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creatures. My ex didn't answer. He just turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the headlights illuminated more of the field, but not quite reaching the tree. The creature that had been watching us didn't run away or stand up. It simply pulled its head back behind the tree, a slow, deliberate movement that somehow made everything even more terrifying. Like it wasn't afraid of us at all. It was just choosing to hide. My ex threw the car into reverse, spun us around faster than I thought possible on that dirt path, and started driving back toward the main road. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "We were going to camp," I said stupidly, still trying to process what I'd just seen. "Change of plans," he replied, his voice tight. "We're going to Lufkin, getting a motel." We drove in silence for several minutes, both of us occasionally checking the rearview mirrors. Once we hit the paved road, my ex finally seemed to relax slightly. "Did you hear anything weird while I was gone?" he asked. I told him about the children laughing, and he nodded grimly. "I heard it too, deeper in the woods. I thought maybe there were people trespassing on the property, so I followed the sounds, but they kept moving, always just out of sight. Then they suddenly stopped." He paused, taking a deep breath. "That's when I felt like something was watching me, something big. I turned around and started heading back to the car, and the whole time I felt like I was being followed." We drove straight to Lufkin, checked into the first motel we found, and barely slept that night. The next morning, we headed home without even discussing going back to the property. Our camping gear remained packed in the trunk. For months afterward, my ex avoided that area entirely. His stepfather kept asking when we'd come back for another hunting trip, but my ex always had excuses. When he finally did return, around 6 months later, he brought 4 other guys with him. Safety in numbers, I guess. I never went back. We divorced a couple years later for unrelated reasons, but that experience stayed with me. It wasn't until later, when I started researching what we might have seen, that I connected the children laughing to the creatures. Apparently, that's a sound often associated with Bigfoot encounters. Some people think they mimic human sounds to lure people deeper into the woods, or maybe that's just what their vocalizations sound like to us. What still sticks with me is how they stayed low to the ground. They never stood upright, even though they clearly could have. It was like they were deliberately trying to conceal themselves, even in that open field. They moved with purpose and intelligence, not like any animal I've ever seen. I've heard plenty of Bigfoot stories over the years, but I always took them with a grain of salt. Now, I'm certain they exist. No second-hand account could ever convince me the way that direct experience did. What we saw that day wasn't a bear, wasn't people in costumes, wasn't any known animal. Sometimes I still have dreams about that lone pine tree and the creature staring at us from behind it. In the dreams, it always steps out fully into the open, but I always wake up before I can see it completely. Maybe that's a blessing. The strangest part, I don't think they meant us harm. They could have approached our car if they wanted to. They were clearly fast and strong, but they kept their distance, just watching, like they were as curious about us as we were terrified of them. I still can't explain the overwhelming sense of dread I felt, though. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was deeper than that, more instinctual, like my body recognized a predator that my mind couldn't identify. To this day, whenever I'm in wooded areas and hear unexpected sounds, especially anything that resembles laughter or human voices, I freeze up. That trip changed something fundamental in how I perceive the wilderness. The forests aren't empty. There are things out there, intelligent things that we don't understand, and they're watching us. Story 4. I never wanted to believe those old stories my grandfather told. You know how it goes. Every small southern town has its monster tales, passed down through generations to scare kids away from dangerous places. I always thought Riley's Break was just another backwoods legend until last November. I'm Jackson Riley, and yes, that swampy hellhole near Orangeburg is named after my family. My grandfather worked logging and sawmills his whole life, just like his daddy before him. Growing up, I'd sit on the porch while Grandpa smoked his pipe and told stories about the Riley's Break booger, what the old-timers called it before the whole Bigfoot craze took over. According to Grandpa, after World War I, his father and another logger abandoned their timber contract in that swamp after something scared them so bad they forfeited their pay. Same thing happened to turpentine workers in the area years later. Nobody would go into certain parts of Riley's Break, especially not after dark. Dad had his own encounter back in the 70s. He, Grandpa, and 2 local coon hunters set up along a game trail, trying to catch this raccoon that had been outsmarting their dogs for weeks. Around midnight, they saw something standing by their dying campfire. Dad said at first glance it looked like a man, but its shoulders were too wide, and the hair caught the firelight, like an old rug hanging on a fence. Before they could get a better look, their coonhounds, dogs that would fearlessly tree mountain lions, went crazy, then ran off whimpering into the brush. They heard branches snapping, dogs yelping like they were hurt. When they reached the area, all they found was clawed-up dirt and broken branches. The dogs came home days later, all cut up and limping. I never saw the thing myself, but I've walked those same trails, heard weird noises at dusk that made the hair on my neck stand up. I always figured it was just my imagination, fueled by those old tales, until last November. I'd been helping clean out Grandpa's old hunting cabin. He passed 3 years ago, and we finally decided to sell the property. While going through his stuff, I found his old journal with detailed notes about booger sightings going back to the 20s. It wasn't just campfire talk. He'd been documenting this thing methodically. The journal showed patterns. The creature seemed to use the creeks and old mill canals as travel routes through the backwoods. I became obsessed. With most witnesses now dead and the last reported encounter back in the late 60s, I thought maybe I could finally put this family mystery to rest. I decided to spend one night in Riley's break, in the area marked in Grandpa's journal as frequent activity. Just me, some basic camping gear and a camera. I arrived around 3 in the afternoon to set up camp before dark. The November air was crisp but not too cold, perfect weather for camping. Riley's break is this mix of cypress knees, blackwater streams and moss-draped oaks that feed into the Edisto River. Beautiful during the day, but it gets real creepy once the sun starts going down. I found a small clearing about 20 yards from one of the old logging canals and set up my tent. The place was exactly as Grandpa had marked in his journal, a spot where 3 game trails intersected near an abandoned mill foundation. I built a small fire, cooked some beans and hot dogs, and settled in. As the sun set, the swamp came alive with sounds, frogs, insects, the occasional splash in the water. Normal stuff. But around 8 o'clock, everything went quiet. Not gradually quiet, just suddenly silent, like someone had flipped a switch. Anyone who spent time in the woods knows that ain't natural. I turned off my flashlight and just listened. Nothing. Then, from across the canal, I heard something moving. Not like a deer or raccoon. This was heavy, deliberate. Whatever it was had weight to it. I could hear water being displaced as it moved along the bank. My heart started hammering in my chest. I wanted to turn my light on so bad, but something told me to stay dark. The movement stopped directly across from my camp. I could feel it watching me. I sat there frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Then I heard it. This low, rumbling growl that didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. Not a bear, not a cougar. It was deeper, almost human-like, but not quite. Then the smell hit me. Jesus Christ, that smell. Like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else I can't even describe. So strong, it made my eyes water. I don't know what possessed me, but I called out, "Hello?" My voice cracked like a damn teenager's. The response was immediate. A series of wood knocks, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. 3 distinct knocks. Pause, then 2 more. Deliberate, communicative. I fumbled for my flashlight, finally flicking it on and pointing it across the canal. The beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me, at least 7 feet off the ground, glowing yellowish green like a cat's, but much larger. They blinked once, then were gone. I heard it moving away, branches breaking under its weight. Then another sound started, this weird, high-pitched whooping call that echoed through the trees. It was answered by another call from further away. There were at least 2 of them. I should have packed up right then, but I was both terrified and fascinated. This was it, the thing my family had been talking about for generations. I grabbed my camera and started recording in the direction of the sounds, though it was too dark to see anything. For the next hour, I heard them circling my camp, always staying just out of sight. They'd snap branches, not by accident, but purposefully, like they were letting me know they were there. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of movement through the trees, but never a clear look. Around 10:30, I decided to add more wood to my fire. As I leaned forward to grab a log, something heavy landed between my tent and me, a rock the size of a softball, splashing mud everywhere. It hadn't fallen from a tree, it had been thrown hard. That's when I truly started to panic. These things, whatever they were getting aggressive. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but of course, no signal. Classic horror movie scenario, except this was really happening. I decided my only option was to make it to my truck, which was parked about a mile away on an old logging road. I quickly packed my essential gear, doused the fire, and grabbed my flashlight and Grandpa's old .38 revolver I'd brought along. As I started down the trail toward my truck, I heard them moving parallel to me on both sides. They were escorting me out, or herding me. I walked as fast as I could without running, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. Every few yards, I'd hear a wood knock or that weird whooping call, always moving alongside me. About halfway to my truck, I came to a narrow part of the trail where it crossed a small stream. As I stepped onto the crude log bridge, my flashlight caught something standing on the trail ahead of me. I'll never forget what I saw in that moment. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice as wide as mine. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, with longer hair hanging from its arms that nearly reached its knees. Its face was the most disturbing part. Not quite human, not quite ape, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. But it was the eyes that haunted me. Intelligent, aware, studying me with what I can only describe as calculated curiosity. We stared at each other for what felt like eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then it opened its mouth, showing teeth that gleamed in my flashlight beam, and let out a deep, chest-rumbling roar that I felt more than heard. I dropped my flashlight. In the moment it took me to fumble and recover it, the creature was gone, just vanished into the underbrush without making a sound, which seemed impossible for something that size. I ran the rest of the way to my truck, certain at any moment I'd feel massive hands grabbing me from behind. Somehow I made it, fumbled with my keys, and peeled out of there, gravel flying. As I reached the main road, I slowed down enough to look in my rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a silhouette. The same massive figure watching me leave, and beside it, a smaller one. It's been 6 months since that night. I haven't told many people about what happened. Who would believe me? I've been back to Riley's Break in daylight looking for evidence. Found some weird prints by that stream crossing, took photos and measurements. Found some strange hair caught on tree bark about 7 feet up that doesn't match any animal I know. I've read everything I can about Bigfoot encounters. So many match what my family experienced. The wood knocks, the growls, the rock throwing. I'm convinced now that what locals called the Riley's Break booger is what others call Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The weirdest part? I don't feel threatened anymore. Terrified that night, sure, but looking back, if they wanted to hurt me, they could have. They were herding me out, protecting their territory. That smaller figure I saw at the end? I think it was a juvenile. They were protecting their young. Grandpa's journal mentioned the last reported encounter was in the late 60s, when logging methods changed from hand axes to large machinery. Maybe the noise drove them deeper into the swamp. Maybe they've been there all along, watching us forget about them. I'm going back next month, this time with better equipment. Part of me hopes I don't find anything, that it was just my imagination running wild in the dark. But another part knows better. The Riley's Break booger is real, and now I need to know more. I just keep wondering if it recognizes me as a Riley, if it's been watching my family for generations, just as we've been telling stories about it. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still smell that distinctive odor and hear those wood knocks in the distance. Story 5. I've never talked about this with anyone outside my family, and even they don't really believe me. Hell, most days I try to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in the dark. But 17 years later, I still scan the tree lines whenever I'm alone outdoors. Some things you just can't shake. This happened back in 2004, when I was 15. My family lived in this rural area near Forest Hill in the Sierra Nevada foothills of California. Our property was pretty isolated, not completely off-grid or anything, but definitely not in town. Every morning I had to walk about a quarter mile from our driveway to catch the school bus at this corner where the county road met this old abandoned logging road. Nobody really used that logging spur anymore, except occasional hunters during season. It was early October, right when the mornings start getting that real autumn feel. You know, when it's still dark when you leave for school and there's that heavy mist hanging in the air. This particular morning was dead quiet. Usually you'd hear birds or distant cars or something, but that day was just silent. The kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. I got to the bus stop around 6:45, same as always. The sun wasn't up yet, and the county hadn't bothered to put a street light at this corner because hardly anyone lived out our way. Just me and maybe 2 other kids who got picked up at this spot, but they were both out sick that day. So I was completely alone, standing there with my backpack, half asleep like most teenagers at that hour. I was just kind of zoning out, thinking about a math test I had later that day, when I heard it, a heavy step on dry leaves behind me, like not a squirrel or a raccoon or something small. This was heavy, like when a full-grown man steps on crunchy leaves and you can hear the weight behind it. I froze. My bus stop was right next to this wooden fence that separated the road from the forest. The fence wasn't much, just those split rail types that are more for marking boundaries than keeping anything in or out. Beyond the fence was nothing but trees and underbrush, getting denser as it went back. At first I thought maybe it was a deer. We had tons of them around, and they'd sometimes come close to the roads in the early morning, but deer don't make that kind of sound when they walk. They're delicate. This was deliberate, heavy. There was one slow step, then silence. I could actually feel the vibration through the ground. That's what really got to me, feeling it through my feet. Whatever it was had enough weight to send a small tremor through packed earth. I remember my heart instantly started hammering in my chest. I tried to play it cool, like I hadn't noticed anything. I casually shifted a few feet down the road, pretending I was just restless or stretching my legs. All the while I was straining to hear or see anything in the darkness behind the fence. After I moved, there were 2 more steps. Steady, measured, like whatever it was had adjusted its position to keep me in sight. But I still couldn't see anything. The tree line was maybe 15 feet beyond the fence, and it was just blackness between the fence and those first trees. I wanted to run. Everything in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there, but there was nowhere to go. My house was too far to sprint back to, and there weren't any neighbors close by. Plus, I kept telling myself I was being stupid. It was probably just a deer or maybe a black bear, though we rarely saw those around our property. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, praying for the bus to come. The county roads stretched out empty in both directions. In the distance, I could just make out the bend where the bus would appear when it finally showed up. That's when I heard it. This deep, thick growl from directly behind me, beyond the fence line, not like a dog or a coyote, not even like a bear. It was lower, more resonant, like it came from something with a massive chest cavity. The sound was ancient, if that makes any sense, primal. It made my entire body go cold. Right at that moment, and I swear this timing couldn't have been more perfect, I saw the headlights of the school bus appear around the bend down the road. I've never been so happy to see those yellow lights in my life. The growl came again, and this time there was movement in the darkness. I didn't wait to see what it was. The second that bus pulled up, I practically leapt through the door. The driver, Mr. Keene, gave me a weird look as I rushed past him to find a seat. "You all right, kid? Look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I just nodded and slumped into the first available seat, my heart still pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't look out the window as we pulled away. I didn't want to see if anything was watching from the tree line. At school that day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying the sounds in my head, those deliberate footsteps, that unnaturally deep growl. I'd grown up in those woods. I knew what bears sounded like, what mountain lions sounded like. This wasn't that. When I got home, I tried to talk to my dad about it. He'd been a forest ranger for 20 years before switching to construction, so he knew the local wildlife better than anyone. "Probably just a bear," he said, barely looking up from the newspaper. "They're moving around more before hibernation." "It wasn't a bear, Dad. Bears don't sound like that." "Well, it sure as hell wasn't Bigfoot if that's what you're thinking," he laughed. But that's exactly what I was thinking. All those stories the local hunters told around campfires, all those accounts from loggers about strange things in the deep woods, they suddenly seemed a lot less like bullshit. The next few mornings, my mom drove me to the bus stop and waited with me until the bus came. I'd told her I was being harassed by some older kids, which wasn't true, but it was better than trying to convince her that some unknown creature had been stalking me in the dark. After about a week, though, things had to go back to normal. My mom's work schedule changed, and I was back to walking to the stop alone. Those were the most terrifying mornings of my life. I'd walk as fast as I could without actually running, constantly looking over my shoulder. I started carrying a hunting knife in my pocket. Not that it would have done much good against whatever I'd heard, but it made me feel a little better. Nothing happened those mornings, but I never shook the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I'd catch movement just at the edge of my vision, or I'd swear I could hear something keeping pace with me just beyond the tree line, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. Then, about 3 weeks after the initial incident, I had another encounter. This time, I was almost to the bus stop when I heard branches breaking deep in the woods, like something large was moving parallel to me. I stopped and stared into the trees, and for just a moment, I swear this is true, I saw something. It was still pretty dark out, but there was this shape, massive and upright, moving between 2 large pine trees about 50 yards into the forest. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. It moved with this weird, fluid grace despite its size, and then it was gone. I ran the rest of the way to the bus stop and didn't stop trembling until I was safely seated on the bus with other kids around me. That winter, I turned 16 and got my driver's license. My parents helped me buy this beat-up old Ford Ranger. Nothing fancy, but it ran. From that day on, I never stood at that bus stop again. Even now, when I go back to visit my parents, they still live in the same house. I drive past that corner with my eyes glued to the ditch and fence line, half expecting to see some massive shape step out from the trees. The other guys at school used to joke about Bigfoot, calling the stories fairy tales for drunks and hunters. They'd laugh about how it was just bears or people's imagination running wild. I'd laugh along with them, never mentioning what happened to me. But inside, I knew there was no joke in it at all. What bothers me most, even now, is the deliberateness of it all. Those weren't random animal noises. Whatever was there that morning was watching me, tracking me, maybe even studying me. It knew exactly what it was doing, moving closer, step by step. And that growl, it wasn't a warning like you'd get from a territorial animal. It was something else, something I still can't explain. I've read accounts online from other people who've had similar experiences, and many describe the same feeling. That sense that you're dealing with something intelligent, something that's choosing to reveal itself to you for reasons you can't understand. I'm 32 now, with a family of my own. We live in Sacramento, far from those foothills, but I still go camping and hiking, and I've never lost my love for the outdoors. I've just developed certain habits. I never hike alone. I always tell someone where I'm going, and I never ever venture into the woods at dawn or dusk if I can help it. Sometimes I wonder if it would have shown itself completely if the bus hadn't come when it did. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd turned around and looked directly into the darkness instead of trying to ignore it. But mostly I'm just grateful for the perfect timing of those headlights coming around the bend. I've told this story to exactly 3 people in my life. My wife, my closest friend, and now, anonymously here. My wife thinks I experienced something real, but suggests it was probably a bear that my teenage mind transformed into something more mysterious. My friend straight up thinks I'm bullshitting him for a good story, but I know what I heard that morning. I know what I felt through the soles of my shoes as something massive shifted its weight behind me. I know what sent ice through my veins when that growl vibrated through the air. The Sierra Nevada foothills hold secrets. Most people will go their whole lives without encountering them. I wish I could say the same. Story 6. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my family. Most people just laugh it off or think I'm making it up for attention. But what happened that day in the summer of '82 has stayed with me for over 40 years now. I still get a chill down my spine when I think about it. I was 12 years old and a proud member of Troop 123. We were on our annual summer camping trip in Wayne National Forest in southeastern Ohio. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months, learning to build fires, tying knots, and all that Boy Scout stuff. My buddy Mike and I were the youngest in the troop, but we were determined to prove ourselves to the older boys. Our main camp was set up near a ranger station, but we'd hiked about 4 miles to Camp Winford for some special activities earlier that day. It was getting late in the afternoon, around 4 or 5 o'clock, and our scoutmaster, Mr. Jenkins, had given Mike and me permission to head back to the main camp ahead of the group. Looking back now, I can't believe he let 2 12-year-old kids wander through those woods alone, but things were different back then. Mr. Jenkins had shown us the trail on a map, an old logging path that cut straight through the forest. He said it was a shortcut that would get us back to camp in about an hour. The older boys were staying behind to finish some merit badge work, and we were supposed to help the assistant scoutmaster start dinner preparations. The beginning of the hike was pretty normal. The path was visible enough, though not well maintained. Mike and I were in high spirits, talking about what badges we wanted to earn next, and complaining about Billy Larson, one of the older scouts who kept hiding our stuff. The forest was thick but peaceful, lots of oak and hickory trees with patches of sunlight breaking through here and there. After about 20 minutes, the trail started to get harder to follow. What had been a clear path was now overgrown with ferns and bushes. The markers, these little orange strips tied to trees, were getting further apart. We slowed down, constantly checking to make sure we were still on the right track. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Mike kept asking, and I kept saying yes, even though I was getting less certain by the minute. The forest was getting denser too. The trees grew closer together, and the canopy overhead blocked out most of the sunlight. It was like the whole place got darker and quieter all at once. You know that feeling when the air seems to change before a storm? It was like that, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky that I could see through the leaves. After another 15 minutes of pushing through undergrowth, we had to admit we'd lost the trail completely. I tried to act confident for Mike's sake, but my stomach was starting to knot up. We should have reached a small creek crossing by then according to Mr. Jenkins' directions, but there was no creek in sight. Just more trees, more ferns, more shadows. "Maybe we should go back," Mike suggested, and I was about to agree when we heard it. A crashing sound came from somewhere behind us, like something big moving through the brush. My first thought was that it must be a deer. We'd seen plenty of deer around the campsite, and they can make a lot of noise when they're running, but this sounded different, heavier. We both froze, straining to hear. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just that crashing sound getting closer. "Hello," I called out, thinking maybe it was some of the older scouts playing a trick on us. My voice sounded small and weak in the stillness of the forest. No answer. Just more rustling, more breaking branches. "Let's keep moving," I whispered to Mike, trying to sound braver than I felt. "The creek has to be around here somewhere." We started walking faster, no longer caring about finding the trail, just wanting to get away from whatever was making that noise. The ground was uneven, with hidden roots and rocks that threatened to trip us with every step. And then we saw them. I still remember every detail of that moment with perfect clarity. We just pushed through a particularly thick patch of undergrowth when there was a sudden violent rustling about 100 feet to our right. 2 large shapes burst out of a thicket and into a small clearing. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. They were moving so fast, charging across the uneven ground with incredible speed. They were big, both around 6 feet tall, and covered in dark brown hair that looked almost black in the dim forest light. They were running on 2 legs, not like a bear occasionally stands up. These things were fully bipedal. Their arms were long and powerful, swinging in rhythm with their strides. Their backs stayed straight, not hunched over like you'd expect from an ape or a bear. They crossed our path about 80 feet ahead of us, running perpendicular to the direction we were heading. They didn't seem to notice us at all. They were focused on something else, something we couldn't see. Mike and I dropped to the ground instinctively, crouching behind a fallen log. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they would hear it, but they just kept running. What happened next is what convinced me these weren't people in suits or some kind of prank. The creatures reached a steep embankment that dropped down to a stream below, a good 15-foot drop at a sharp angle. Without slowing down at all, they descended that slope with unbelievable agility, somehow keeping their balance on the loose soil and rocks. Then, when they reached the bottom, both creatures leaped across the stream in a single bound. The water had to be at least 10 feet wide at that point. No human could make that jump from a standing position, let alone after running down a steep slope. They landed on the other side and immediately started climbing up the opposite embankment, using their long arms to pull themselves up through the brush. They moved with such power and grace, like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Within seconds, they had disappeared into the forest on the other side. The whole thing probably lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the spot where they'd vanished, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Mike was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. I shook my head, unable to form words. My entire body was trembling. "Were those bears?" he asked. But we both knew they weren't bears. Bears don't run like that. They don't move like that. "We need to go," I finally managed to say. "We need to go right now." We didn't discuss which way to go. We just turned around and ran back the way we had come. Panic gave us speed we didn't know we had. We crashed through bushes and jumped over fallen trees, driven by pure adrenaline. I kept expecting to hear those things coming after us, kept imagining hot breath on the back of my neck. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a fresh wave of terror through me. But we didn't stop running until we broke out of the forest and onto the gravel road that led to Camp Winford. We collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. Mike's face was ghostly white, and I'm sure mine was too. "Did that really just happen?" he asked between breaths. Before I could answer, we heard the rumble of an engine. An old pickup truck was coming down the road. Without even discussing it, we both jumped up and started waving our arms frantically. The truck slowed down and stopped beside us. The driver was an older man with a gray beard who looked at us with concern. "You boys all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." We blurted out our story, talking over each other in our desperation to explain what had happened. The man listened patiently, but I could tell from his expression that he didn't believe us. Still, he offered us a ride back to our main camp, and we gratefully climbed into the bed of his truck. When we got back to camp, we told our story again to Mr. Jenkins and the assistant scoutmaster. They exchanged looks that made it clear they thought we were making it up, or had seen a couple of deer and let our imaginations run wild. The other scouts who had returned by then just laughed and called us babies. "There aren't any bears in this part of Ohio," Mr. Jenkins said, trying to sound reassuring. "And there certainly aren't any, well, whatever you think you saw." "But we did see them," Mike insisted. "They were real." "I'm sure you saw something," the assistant scoutmaster said in that patronizing adult tone. "But sometimes our eyes play tricks on us in the forest, especially when we're lost and scared." They made us drink some hot chocolate and told us to get some rest. The subject was closed as far as they were concerned. That night in our tent, Mike and I whispered about what we'd seen. We promised each other we'd never forget it, that we'd tell people the truth no matter what. But as the years went by, Mike eventually stopped talking about it. The last time I saw him at our high school graduation, he laughed it off as a shared childhood fantasy. But I know what I saw. Those weren't bears or deer or people in costumes. The way they moved, the power and speed and agility wasn't human or like any animal I'd ever seen. No person could navigate that rough terrain at that speed, make that jump across the stream, or climb that embankment with such ease. Years later, in my 20s, I started researching and found reports of Bigfoot sightings in southern Ohio counties, in Vinton, Hocking, and Athens counties, all near Wayne National Forest. Some of the descriptions matched exactly what Mike and I had seen that summer day. I've never gone camping in those woods again. I've never even gone hiking in a dense forest since then. My kids think I'm just not the outdoorsy type. But how do you explain to your family that you're afraid of running into something that most people don't believe exists? Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, thinking I hear that crashing sound coming through the trees. In my dreams, those creatures don't run past us. They turn and see us and come charging straight at us with those powerful strides. I don't know what Mike and I saw that day in 1982. I don't know if they were what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely, but they were real, they were there, and not a day goes by that I don't wonder what would have happened if they had noticed us watching them from behind that fallen log. To this day, I can't explain it. No one believes me, but I know what I saw, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. Story 7. I've debated for years about sharing this. It's something I've carried with me since I was 6 years old, and even now, at 24, I still get chills thinking about it. I've told this to exactly 3 people in my life. My mom, who didn't believe me, my college roommate, who thought I was making it up, and my husband, who's the only one who actually listened without judgment. This happened in Atala County back in 2006. Late spring, when the weather was just getting warm enough for us kids to play outside all day. I was 6 years old, and my best friend Ronnie Joe lived in the house next to mine. Our backyards kind of blended together in this big open space that wasn't really anybody's property. It was just a stretch of land with tall grass, wildflowers, and these little patches of dirt where we'd build stick forts or hunt for bugs. That day started like any normal Saturday. My mum was inside watching TV, and she told me I could play outside until lunchtime. Ronnie Joe came over around 9 in the morning, and we were doing what we always did, chasing grasshoppers, collecting interesting rocks, and trying to build a fort out of sticks we'd gathered. Nothing unusual. It must have been around 11 when we first heard it. This weird thumping sound, like someone hitting the ground rhythmically. At first, we thought it was Mr. Peterson from down the street working on his fence or something, but it was coming from behind the Miller's house. They lived on the other side of the open field area. "What's that?" Ronnie Joe asked, dropping the stick he was using to poke at an anthill. "Don't know," I said, but I was curious. We both were. The sound was steady. Thump, thump, thump. Not super loud, but definitely noticeable in the quiet of our neighborhood, so we decided to check it out. We abandoned our half-built stick fort and started creeping through the tall grass toward the sound. I remember feeling like we were on an adventure, like explorers in the wilderness. We were trying to be quiet, giggling a little, making shh noises at each other when one of us rustled the grass too much. The thumping got louder as we got closer to the Miller's backyard. We were crawling by this point, pushing through grass that was almost as tall as we were when we were hunched down. I remember the smell of the earth and the feeling of the grass scratching against my bare arms. We stopped at the edge of a small clearing, still hidden in the grass, when we saw it, even now typing. This makes my hands shake. About 30 feet away from us was something. I didn't have a word for it then. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I'd ever seen before or since. It was big, so much bigger than any grown-up I knew. It was standing upright on 2 legs, and it was using sticks to dig in the ground, not little twigs like we were playing with, but actual branches. The movement was what made the thumping sound. It was hitting the ground with these sticks, digging at something. The thing was covered in brown hair, Not fur exactly, but hair. It was thick and shaggy, hanging down from its arms and back. Across its chest and belly, the hair was different, lighter, grayish. I remember thinking it looked sort of like my grandpa's beard, which was brown but going grey in patches. Its arms were what really stuck out to me. They were so long, way longer than a person's arm should be. They looked powerful, with muscles visible even under all that hair. The hair wasn't matted or dirty like you might expect from a wild animal. It looked, I don't know how to describe it except to say it looked maintained somehow. Ronnie, Joe and I were frozen. We weren't even breathing, I think. We were just staring, trying to process what we were seeing. I remember thinking that maybe it was someone in a costume, but even at 6, I knew that didn't make sense. The movements were too natural, too fluid. And then it stopped digging. The thumping noise just stopped and the silence felt so heavy. The creature dropped the sticks it was using and slowly, very slowly, stood up to its full height. It was tall, so tall. Taller than my dad, taller than anyone I'd ever seen. Then it turned. It turned right toward us, like it knew exactly where we were hiding in the grass. I don't know if it heard us or smelled us or what, but it knew we were there. And it started walking toward us. Not running, not charging, just walking deliberately in our direction. I wanted to run. Everything in me was screaming to get up and run back to my house, to my mum, to safety. But I couldn't move. I was completely paralyzed with fear. Ronnie Joe was the same next to me. I could hear his breathing getting faster and faster, but he wasn't moving either. When it got about 25 feet away, close enough that I could see details of its face, it stopped, and then it did something that still haunts my nightmares. It opened its mouth slightly, just enough for me to see its teeth. They were yellow, large, and not like human teeth at all. It wasn't smiling. It was more like a warning, like when a dog bares its teeth before it attacks. Its face is burned into my memory. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any ape I've seen in books or at the zoo either. It was something in between. It had this heavy brow that shadowed its eyes, making them look dark and deep-set. The skin on its face was darker than the hair, leathery looking. But the thing I remember most vividly, the detail that I still see sometimes when I close my eyes, was its hands. They had these long, thick fingernails, not claws exactly, but definitely not human nails either. They were dirty, yellowish, and attached to fingers that looked incredibly strong. I remember thinking they could crush my arm without any effort. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Us, frozen in fear, the creature standing there with its teeth slightly exposed, watching us. Then, without making a sound, it turned away from us. It just turned and walked off, disappearing behind some bushes near the miller's house. Even after it was gone, Ronnie, Joe and I didn't move. I don't think we could. The fear had completely taken over our bodies. We just sat there in the grass, barely breathing, waiting for it to come back. I don't know how long we stayed there. It might have been 5 minutes or 30. Time didn't make sense anymore. Eventually, my mum came looking for me because lunch was ready. She found us still sitting in the grass, pale and quiet. "What are you two doing out here?" she asked, and her voice made me jump. I remember looking at Ronnie Joe, and something passed between us. Some unspoken agreement. We were both thinking the same thing. No one would believe us. "Nothing," I said, "just playing." "Something was digging over there," Ronnie Joe added, pointing vaguely toward where we'd seen the creature. My mum didn't think anything of it. She just told us to come wash up for lunch, and we followed her back to the house like robots, constantly looking over our shoulders. Ronnie, Joe and I never really talked about what we saw that day. Not properly. Sometimes we'd reference it indirectly. "Remember that thing?" one of us would say, and the other would just nod. But we never discussed the details, never tried to make sense of it together. It was like we both wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. His family moved away about a year later, and I haven't spoken to him since. I've always wondered if he remembers it the same way I do, if it affected him the way it affected me. For years afterward, I was terrified of the backyard. I wouldn't go out there alone. especially not near the tall grass. I had nightmares about those yellow teeth, those long fingers with their dirty nails. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced the creature was standing outside my window, watching me. As I got older, I tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was just a person. Maybe it was some kind of bear, though bears aren't common in our area, and they definitely don't use sticks as tools. I researched local wildlife extensively, but nothing matched what we saw. It wasn't until I was in high school, browsing the internet one night, that I came across descriptions and drawings of Bigfoot. The long arms, the mixture of brown and grey hair, the height, the face that wasn't quite human but wasn't quite ape. It all matched what Ronnie Joe and I had seen that day. I've since read countless accounts of Bigfoot sightings, watched documentaries, even joined online forums where people share their experiences. Some of the descriptions are so similar to what we saw that it makes my skin crawl. I'm convinced now that's what it was. A Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. The thing that still bothers me the most is why it was digging. What was it looking for, and why did it just let us go? From everything I've read, these creatures are typically shy and avoid human contact. But this one walked toward us, showed us its teeth in what seemed like a warning, and then just left. It could have hurt us if it wanted to. We were completely helpless, but it didn't. Sometimes I drive by my old neighborhood when I visit my parents. The open field where we used to play is gone now. They built new houses there about 5 years ago. The Miller's house is still there, though the family moved out long ago. I always slow down when I pass by, staring at the spot where we saw it, half expecting to see it standing there again, digging with its sticks. I've never gone back to that exact spot. I don't think I could make myself do it. The fear is still too raw, too real. I know how this all sounds. I know most people reading this will think I'm making it up or that I saw something ordinary, and my 6-year-old imagination turned it into something monstrous. Maybe that's true. Maybe memory has distorted what really happened. But Ronnie Joe saw it too. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if he's out there somewhere, still carrying this memory like I am, still wondering what exactly we saw that spring day in Atala County. Whatever it was, it changed me. I don't go hiking alone. I don't camp. I don't even like being in wooded areas during the day, let alone at night. Because I know there are things out there that we can't explain, things that shouldn't exist but do. And sometimes they watch us from just 30 feet away, with yellow teeth and long, dirty fingernails, deciding whether to approach or to disappear back into the unknown. Story 8. I've been sitting on this experience for several years now, and I still don't know what to make of it. I'm not the type of guy who believes in monsters or goes looking for weird stuff in the woods. I'm a musician from Daytona Beach, Florida, and until a few years ago, I'd never even been camping in my entire life. Growing up in Florida, our idea of roughing it was staying at a hotel without a pool. My band was recording in Vancouver for about 3 weeks. It was our first time in Canada, and we were all pretty excited to be there. The studio sessions were going well, but after about 2 weeks of being cooped up in the recording studio, we all needed a break. That's when Simon, this local guy we'd met through our producer, suggested we take a weekend camping trip to Vancouver Island. I was hesitant at first. Like I said, I'd never been camping before, but my wife was excited about the idea. She'd gone camping with her family growing up and kept telling me how beautiful the forests in the Pacific Northwest were supposed to be. So I agreed, thinking it would be a nice break from the endless takes and retakes in the studio. There were 6 of us who went, me, my wife, my bandmate Matt, Simon, and 2 other women who were friends with Simon. We took a ferry over to Vancouver Island and drove to this spot near Port Alberni that Simon knew about. It wasn't an official campground, more like a clearing in the woods near a small lake that locals used. Pretty remote, but Simon assured us it was a great spot. We arrived in the afternoon and spent a couple hours setting up camp. I was completely useless, but luckily everyone else knew what they were doing. Simon and Matt set up the tents, while my wife and the other women organized our supplies. I mostly just carried stuff from the car and tried to stay out of the way. By early evening, we had a decent campsite set up with 3 tents and a fire pit. The women decided they wanted to drive into town to pick up some extra supplies. Apparently Simon had forgotten to bring enough coffee, which my wife considered an emergency situation. Matt and Simon said they'd go look for firewood, and somehow I got stuck with staying behind to tend the fire, which was barely even going at that point. So there I was, alone at the campsite, trying to keep this sad little fire from dying out completely. I poked at it with a stick for a while, but it was clear I needed more wood. I didn't want to wander too far from camp, so I started looking around the clearing for small branches and sticks that might burn. About 20 yards from our campsite, I spotted this partially broken branch hanging from a tree. It looked dry enough to burn, so I walked over and started pulling on it. The thing was stubborn. It was cracked but still attached, hanging about 7 feet up. I'm 6'2", so I could reach it, but I couldn't get enough leverage to snap it off completely. While I was struggling with this branch, I got this feeling like I was being watched. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? I glanced over my shoulder towards some bushes about 15 yards away, and I swear I saw something moving in there. My first thought was bear, because Simon had warned us there were black bears in the area. I didn't want to make any sudden movements that might provoke it, so I just kept pulling on the branch, pretending I hadn't seen anything. I figured if I acted normal and didn't make eye contact, the bear would probably just move on. That's what they tell you to do with bears, right? After a minute or so of pretending to be super interested in this branch, I snuck another look over my shoulder. What I saw made me freeze. It definitely wasn't a bear. At first I thought maybe it was a person, someone with a disability or something, because it seemed to be crouched down in a really strange position. It was partially hidden by the bushes, but I could make out what looked like a head and shoulders. I'm not sure why, but I wasn't scared. Confused, yes, but not frightened. I called out something like, "Hey there, didn't see you. You okay?" Treating it like it was just some random hiker who'd wandered up to our campsite. That's when it stood up. I'll never forget what happened next. This thing straightened up on 2 legs, and I realized it was way bigger than I'd initially thought. It wasn't as tall as I expected, though, maybe 6.5 feet or so, but it was wide. I mean, the shoulders on this thing were twice as broad as mine, and I'm not a small guy. The body was thick, solid-looking, covered in dark hair or fur that wasn't shaggy, but more like a dense coat. The weirdest part was how it moved. When it stood up, it didn't move like a person. There was this strange swaying motion to its arms that I've never seen in a human being. It was fluid, but somehow mechanical at the same time, if that makes any sense. Like its joints worked differently than ours. It just stood there looking at me for what was probably only a couple of seconds, but felt like forever. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was partially shadowed, and honestly, I was so focused on its bizarre body movements that I wasn't really looking at its features. What I remember most was the silhouette, that impossibly wide frame that tapered down to a waist that was still broader than any humans I've ever seen. Then, without making a sound, it just turned and walked away. No running, no threatening gestures, nothing dramatic. It simply turned and walked into the trees. The crazy thing was how quickly it disappeared. It took maybe 3 or 4 steps and was completely gone from sight, swallowed up by the forest. And it was silent. Something that size should have made noise moving through underbrush. But there was nothing, no cracking twigs, no rustling leaves. It was just there one moment and gone the next. I stood there for, I don't know how long, still holding onto that stupid branch, trying to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk on 2 legs like that. It wasn't a person in a costume. The movements were too natural, yet too inhuman at the same time. No human has shoulders that wide or moves with that peculiar swaying gait. The thing is, I didn't feel threatened at any point. Whatever this creature was, it showed no aggression toward me. It seemed almost as curious about me as I was about it. There was this moment of mutual acknowledgement, and then it simply left. When the others came back, I didn't say anything. What was I supposed to say? Hey guys, I think I just saw Bigfoot. They'd think I was trying to pull a prank, or that I'd been drinking the beers we'd brought along. Besides, I wasn't even sure what I'd seen. Maybe it was just some weird optical illusion caused by shadows in the forest. Or maybe my brain was playing tricks on me because I was in an unfamiliar environment. But deep down, I knew what I saw wasn't something I could easily explain away. I kept quiet about it the whole weekend. We hiked, fished, sat around the campfire telling stories, normal camping stuff. I kept expecting to see it again or to hear something unusual in the woods at night, but nothing happened. The rest of the trip was completely uneventful. I didn't tell anyone about it for months, not even my wife. It wasn't until we were back in Florida, almost half a year later, that I finally mentioned it to her. She looked at me for a long time before asking why I hadn't said anything when it happened. I couldn't really give her a good answer. I think part of me was afraid of being labeled as that guy. You know, the one who claims to have seen Bigfoot. The more time that passes, the more I question my own memory of the event. Did it really happen the way I remember it? Was it really as strange as it seemed at the time? But then I remember that distinctive way it moved, that arm-swaying motion that was so unlike anything I've ever seen a human do, and I know I didn't imagine that. I've watched countless nature documentaries since then, trying to find an animal that moves the way that thing moved. I've looked at videos of bears walking on their hind legs and people in gorilla suits, but nothing matches what I saw. Bears don't have that width of shoulder or that distinctive gait, and people in suits, well, they move like people in suits. I'm not claiming I saw Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I'm just saying I saw something in those woods near Port Alberni that I can't explain. Something that walked on two legs but wasn't human. Something that moved with a grace that belied its bulk. Something that, despite its size and strangeness, didn't feel threatening or dangerous. It's been years now, and I still think about that encounter every time I'm outdoors. I've never gone camping again, not because I'm afraid, but because nothing could live up to that experience. How do you go back to normal camping after something like that? I don't expect anyone to believe me. And honestly, I'm not sure I'd believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw, even if I don't know what it was. And the strangest part of all, sometimes I wish I could see it again, just to confirm to myself that it was real. That for a brief moment in the woods of Vancouver Island, I had an encounter with something unexplainable. I still play music in Daytona Beach. Life goes on as normal. But sometimes when I'm on stage, I'll scan the audience and wonder if anyone else there has seen something they can't explain. If anyone else has had that moment where the world as you understand it shifts slightly, revealing something hidden just beneath the surface of what we consider reality. Whatever it was I saw that day, it changed me. Not in any dramatic way, but in the quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts. There's now always that question in the back of my mind. What else might be out there that we don't understand? Story 9. I don't talk about this much. It happened back in 1965 when I was just a kid, and most people either laugh or think I'm making it up. But I know what I experienced that day in the woods behind Fort Gordon military housing, and it still gives me chills thinking about it almost 60 years later. My dad was an NCO in the Army, and we lived in the enlisted housing area at Fort Gordon, Georgia. I was about 11 years old then, just at that age where you start exploring everywhere, thinking you're invincible. The housing area backed right up to this huge stretch of Georgia woods, pine trees, thick underbrush, the works. It was my playground. One hot afternoon in late summer, I was hanging out with this girl from down the street. Susan. We were just sitting on her front steps when she started telling me about how her little brother had been scared out of his mind the night before. According to her, he'd woken up screaming that there was a big man looking in his bedroom window. The weird part? Their windows were ground level, but they were a good 8 feet up from the ground outside. Her parents had dismissed it as a nightmare, but she seemed genuinely freaked out. I didn't think much of it at the time. Kids have nightmares, right? But the next day, I was bored and decided to go explore the woods like I usually did. There was construction going on for new officer housing at the edge of the woods. Bulldozers had cleared this huge area of red Georgia clay, and it made for a stark boundary between the housing area and the forest. That's where I saw them. Footprints. But not just any footprints. These things were massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say they were at least 18 inches long and about 5 inches wide. They were barefoot prints, clearly showing 5 toes. And they went from the direction of the housing area straight into the tree line. I stood there staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No human has feet that big. I tried putting my own foot next to one print, and it was more than twice the size of mine. I felt this weird mix of fear and curiosity. Instead of running home like I probably should have, I decided to follow the trail into the woods. The prints disappeared once they hit the pine needle-covered forest floor, but I kept going down this familiar path I'd walked dozens of times before. About a quarter mile in, I noticed something strange. The woods were completely silent. Usually, you'd hear birds, insects buzzing, squirrels rustling around, but there was nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. I remember stopping at this big rock I often used as a rest spot and sitting down, suddenly aware that something felt very wrong. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, straining to hear anything. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, definitely walking on 2 legs, not 4. They were coming from about 40 feet away, in a really thick section of underbrush where I couldn't see anything. The steps were slow, deliberate, and heavy enough to crack twigs and rustle leaves. My first thought was that it might be another kid from the housing area, or maybe an MP patrolling the perimeter. I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" But no answer came back, just silence again. I decided it was time to head back. As I stood up and started walking toward the housing area, the footsteps started again. But this time, they were moving parallel to me, keeping pace exactly with my own steps. When I sped up, they sped up. When I stopped, they stopped. It was like whatever was making those sounds was mimicking me deliberately, keeping the same distance away, but matching my movements exactly. I tried to convince myself it was just an echo or my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was following me. I started walking faster, and the footsteps kept perfect pace. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was maybe 100 yards from the edge of the woods when everything changed. The footsteps suddenly got faster, much faster, and I could hear the underbrush being violently pushed aside as whatever it was charged directly toward me. The sound was terrifying, like something massive was crashing through the woods straight at me. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back. I burst out of the tree line and didn't stop until I reached the concrete sidewalk of the housing area. My lungs were burning, and I was shaking all over. When I finally got the courage to look back at the woods, I saw nothing, just the still, quiet tree line. I didn't tell my parents. Dad was strict military, and Mom would have just worried. Instead, I went to my friend Bobby's house the next day and told him everything. He listened to my story without laughing, which surprised me. When I finished, he looked serious and said, "Those sound like Bigfoot monster prints. I hadn't even considered that. Bigfoot was just something from tabloid papers and late-night stories. But as soon as Bobby said it, something clicked. The massive footprints, the way it had stalked me, the intelligence it showed by matching my pace, it made a horrible kind of sense." Bobby wanted to see the prints, so we went back to the construction area. They were still there, though partly messed up by the previous day's work. Bobby took one look at them and got really quiet. He'd been skeptical until that moment, but seeing those huge barefoot impressions in the red clay changed something in him. "I want to see where it followed you," he said. "I was terrified to go back in those woods, but having Bobby with me made it seem less crazy." We walked down the same trail, me pointing out where I'd been sitting on the rock. We both sat there for a while, listening. Just like before, the woods were unnaturally silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. "It's too quiet," Bobby whispered, and I could see he was starting to get scared too. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes when it started again, the footsteps at the same distance as before, moving through the underbrush. Bobby's eyes went wide. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "That's what followed me yesterday," I said, my voice shaking. We sat frozen, listening as the footsteps moved slowly around us, never coming closer but never moving away either. It was like whatever it was circling us, staying just out of sight in the thickest parts of the brush. "Let's go," Bobby finally said. "I don't like this." We stood up and started walking back toward the housing area. Just like the day before, the footsteps matched our pace exactly, walking parallel to us about 40 feet away. Bobby kept looking over toward the sound, squinting like he was trying to see through the thick vegetation. We picked up our pace, and so did the footsteps. We were about the same distance from the edge of the woods as I'd been the day before, when it happened again. The sudden charge, the violent crashing through the underbrush as whatever it was came straight at us. We both took off running. Bobby was a faster runner than me, and he pulled ahead quickly. As we ran, he suddenly yelled, "I see it! I see something!" I didn't look back. I was too scared. But Bobby told me later that he'd caught a glimpse of something large moving through the brush. "It wasn't a person," he insisted. "It was too big, and it wasn't running like a person runs." We made it back to the housing area and collapsed on someone's lawn, gasping for breath. Bobby was white as a sheet. "That was real," he kept saying. "That was really real." After that day, I never went deep into those woods again. A few times, I'd stand at the edge of the tree line and stare in, and every time I'd get this overwhelming feeling that something was staring back at me. Sometimes at night, I'd look out my bedroom window toward the woods and swear I could see something large and dark standing just inside the tree line, watching our housing area. We moved away from Fort Gordon about 6 months later when my dad got transferred. I never told my parents what happened. What would I say? That I was chased by Bigfoot? That there was some unknown creature living in the woods behind military housing? They would have thought I was making it up for attention, but I know what I experienced. Those footprints were real, 18 inches long and clearly not human. The way that thing stalked me, the intelligence it showed by matching my movements exactly, that wasn't an animal acting on instinct, and the aggression when it charged at us, that was deliberate, territorial behavior. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened in those woods. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar experiences, and there's something validating about knowing I'm not alone. But I still get a cold feeling in the pit of my stomach when I think about those heavy footsteps following me through the silent woods of Fort Gordon. And I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made it out of the tree line in time. Story 10. I've never been one for the supernatural or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. Honestly, I'd roll my eyes whenever my buddy Greg would send me those Finding Bigfoot clips. "It's just guys in the woods hearing twigs snap," I'd tell him. Well, I don't roll my eyes anymore. Not since last Thursday. I'm 54, lived in San Francisco most of my adult life. I work in software sales. Nothing exciting, nothing that would prepare me for what happened. I was driving up to visit my friend in Gold Beach, Oregon. It's about a 6-hour drive from SF, and I make the trip maybe twice a year. Greg moved up there after retiring early, lucky bastard, and he's got this little place right on the coast. Beautiful spot. Anyway, I was driving my Honda CR-V, just got it last year, still has that new car smell, and was making good time. I'd left around 7 in the morning, stopped once for gas and a bathroom break in Ukiah, then pushed on through the redwoods. Highway 101 is gorgeous through there, but it's also winding as hell, and you inevitably get stuck behind tourists or logging trucks. So I'm about 20 miles south of Crescent City, in that stretch where the road hugs the coastline. It was around 1 in the afternoon, sunny day, not much traffic. I'd been stuck behind this old Winnebago for about 15 minutes, going maybe 40 in a 55 zone. There was a line of cars building up behind me. You know how it is on those coastal highways. Finally, I see one of those turnouts coming up, so I put on my signal to pull over and let the cars behind me pass. The turnout was just a small gravel area, probably designed for people to stop and take pictures of the ocean view. I pulled in, turned off my podcast, it was something about the history of video games, and just sat there with my window down, enjoying the fresh air while I waited for the line of cars to pass. 5 cars went by, then nothing. Highway was clear again. I was about to pull back onto the road when I heard it. God, even typing this now makes my hands shake. It was the most horrifying sound I've ever heard in my life, not like anything I could describe properly. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a scream, but not human. It had this, I don't know, this depth to it, like it came from something with lungs twice the size of a person's. It had this weird warbling quality at the end, almost like it was speaking in some language. The pitch started high and then dropped suddenly, vibrating in a way that made my teeth feel weird. It was so loud and so close that I physically ducked down in my seat. Pure instinct. I didn't even think. My body just reacted. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I swear to God, I thought I was having a heart attack. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe for a second. When I looked up, and I'll remember this moment until the day I die, there it was, right next to my car on the passenger side. Right fucking there. It looked like a filthy gorilla, but wrong. All wrong. First off, we don't have gorillas in Northern California. Second, it was standing upright, completely vertical like a person. It was tall. I'm guessing 6.5, maybe 7 feet. The proportions were off for a human, though. The arms hung down way too low, almost to the knees. The face, I only caught it in 3/4 profile as it was already turning away, had this wedge shape to it, like the forehead sloped back dramatically, no real chin to speak of. The hair was matted and dirty, dark brown, covering most of the body. There were patches where I could see skin underneath, which looked grayish-brown. The smell hit me a second later, like wet dog mixed with something rotting and a musky, sour odor I can't even describe. It was overpowering, coming through my open window. As soon as I made eye contact with it, the thing bolted. It didn't move like a person. 3 massive strides, and it was across the gravel and into the tree line. The speed was unreal. I've seen Olympic sprinters on TV, and this thing would have left them in the dust. The brush at the edge of the turnout was dense, like really thick, tall ferns and bushes, but it just crashed through like it was nothing and disappeared. The whole sighting lasted maybe 3-4 seconds tops, but it felt like time slowed down, you know, like every detail was burned into my brain in slow motion. Here's the weird thing. Seeing it wasn't what scared me the most. Don't get me wrong, the sight of this massive, hairy creature was terrifying. But that scream, that ungodly noise it made right next to my open window, that's what nearly stopped my heart. I've never heard anything like it before, and I pray to God I never hear it again. After it disappeared, I just sat there, frozen. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I was just trying to process what the hell had just happened. A car drove by on the highway, and that snapped me out of it. I fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the car started. I remember looking in all my mirrors frantically, terrified this thing was going to come back. When I finally got the car started, I peeled out of that turnout so fast I sprayed gravel everywhere. I drove like a maniac for the next few miles, way over the speed limit, constantly checking my mirrors. My heart was still racing, and I felt sick to my stomach. I kept the windows up and the doors locked for all the good that would do. When I hit Crescent City, I pulled into the first gas station I saw, even though I had plenty of gas. I just needed to be around people, to be somewhere normal. I went inside and bought a coffee I didn't want, just to have an excuse to stand in the store for a few minutes. The clerk asked if I was okay. Apparently, I looked as bad as I felt. I just mumbled something about being tired from driving. I sat in my car in that gas station parking lot for almost an hour, trying to calm down, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear. No, bears don't walk upright like that. A person in a costume, in the middle of nowhere, right next to a highway, and no costume could make a sound like that. It vibrated through my entire body. I called Greg to tell him I'd be late. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what happened, not over the phone. He'd think I was having a mental breakdown or something. Hell, I thought I might be having one. The rest of the drive to Gold Beach was a blur. I kept the radio off, windows up. Every time I passed a wooded area, I felt my body tense up. When I finally reached Greg's place, it was almost 5 in the afternoon. I should have been there by 3. Greg took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I laughed, but it came out all wrong. "Not a ghost," I said. We sat on his deck overlooking the ocean, and I told him everything. I expected him to laugh or at least look skeptical. But he didn't. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, he just nodded slowly. "You're not the first person to see something like that around here," he said quietly. He told me about local stories, encounters other people had had in the woods around Gold Beach and Crescent City, loggers, hikers, even a few highway patrol officers who wouldn't go on record, but would talk about strange things they'd seen in the forests late at night. Greg had been collecting these stories since he moved up there. Turned out his interest in Bigfoot wasn't just some quirky hobby. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scream again. When I did finally drift off, I had nightmares about being chased through dense woods by something I couldn't see but could hear crashing behind me. The next morning, Greg suggested we drive back to the turnout. "Just to look around," he said. Part of me wanted to prove to myself that there was some rational explanation, but a bigger part of me couldn't face going back there. Just the thought made my chest tighten up again. "I'm not ready," I told him, and I wasn't. Maybe I never will be. I cut my visit short, drove back to San Francisco the following day, taking the inland route through Grants Pass and down I-5. Longer, but I couldn't face Highway 101 again. It's been 5 days now. I've tried to research what I saw online. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I've read other encounter stories, listened to podcasts about cryptids. Some sound similar to what I experienced, but nothing quite captures that sound, that terrible scream. I used to think people who claimed to see these things were either attention seekers or had just misidentified a bear or some other animal. I get it now. I understand why they sound so convinced, so shaken. Because I am too. I don't know what I saw out there on Highway 101. I don't have a fancy camera with a telephoto lens, and I was too terrified to even think about grabbing my phone for a picture. All I have is what I remember, what I can still see when I close my eyes. But that scream, that's what stays with me. That's what wakes me up at night, covered in sweat. That's what I hear when I'm alone in my apartment and the city outside goes quiet for a moment. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, if someone had told me this story a week ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. All I know is what I experienced, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. And I'm never driving that stretch of Highway 101 again. Not alone, not with the windows down, not ever. Story 11. I've been hesitating to write this down for a long time. It's been 12 years now, and Sarah and I still talk about it sometimes, but only between ourselves. We've never told anyone else the full story because, well, you know how it goes. People think you're crazy or making things up for attention. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened in early July of 2011. Sarah and I were doing what we loved most during summer, jug fishing on the Ohio River. We live near Manchester, Ohio, and have been fishing these waters pretty much our whole lives. That day started like any other fishing day. We loaded up our small aluminum boat around 5 in the morning, packed some sandwiches, drinks, and our fishing gear. The weather was perfect, not too hot yet, with that kind of morning mist hanging over the water that burns off as the sun rises. We had set up about 15 jugs along a stretch of the river we knew well. For those who don't know, jug fishing involves using plastic containers as bobbers with baited lines attached to them. You set them and then follow along, collecting fish as the jugs indicate a catch. It's a relaxing way to fish, and you can cover a lot of water. We had been out for maybe 3 hours, and the fishing was decent. We'd caught a few catfish, nothing huge, but enough to make it worthwhile. It was around 8:30 in the morning when we started drifting toward a bend in the river that has a steep, wooded bank on one side. This area was a bit more remote than where we usually fished. The bank rises pretty sharply from the water, maybe 20 or 30 feet up, before the actual forest begins. That's when Sarah nudged me and pointed toward the shoreline. "Mike, is that a bear?" she whispered. I looked where she was pointing and saw something dark at the water's edge about 70 yards ahead of us. The current was taking us closer, and I didn't start the outboard because I didn't want to scare whatever it was away just yet. From that distance, it looked like it could be a bear on all fours, or maybe even a person in dark clothes crouching down. "I don't think bears come down this far," I said quietly. "Probably just someone fishing." But as our boat drifted closer, maybe to about 50 yards, I started to feel uneasy. There was something not quite right about the shape. It was definitely big, whatever it was, and it seemed to be drinking or scooping something from the water's edge. The morning light was still coming through the trees, creating dappled shadows, which made it hard to see clearly. Sarah gripped my arm. Her hand was ice cold despite the warm morning. "That's not a person," she whispered. I could hear the fear in her voice. I reached for my phone to take a picture, but in my nervousness, I fumbled and nearly dropped it in the water. By the time I had a secure grip on it, everything changed. The figure at the waterline suddenly stood up. I still get chills remembering this moment. It rose up on 2 legs and kept rising and rising. This thing was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered entirely in dark brown or black hair, not fur like a bear, but coarse, thick hair that hung in patches from its body. The hair wasn't even like on a bear or gorilla, but uneven and shaggy. But it was the proportions that were so wrong. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, far longer than any human's should be. The shoulders were impossibly wide. I'd guess at least twice the width of my own, and I'm not a small guy. The head was the strangest part, rounded on top with no visible neck. It just sat there, low between those massive shoulders, like it was hunched forward. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. I couldn't even think straight. My brain was trying to categorize what I was seeing, but nothing fit. It wasn't a bear. It definitely wasn't a person. It was standing there, completely still now, water dripping from its arms into the river. Our boat had continued to drift closer during these few seconds, and we were now maybe 30 yards from the shore. Close enough that if this thing decided to come at us, we'd have very little time to react. The current was pushing us almost directly toward it. Then it noticed us. I'll never forget how it turned its entire upper body toward our boat. I couldn't make out facial features clearly. Its face seemed to be covered in the same dark hair, but there was a patch that looked lighter around what I guess was its face. What I do remember with absolute clarity was the stillness. It just froze and stared at us. No movement at all for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Sarah was squeezing my arm so hard it hurt, but I barely noticed. I was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to run and the physical impossibility of doing so in the middle of a river in a small boat. Then it moved. It turned away from us in one fluid motion and began to climb the bank. That's when I finally snapped out of it and reached for the outboard motor pull start. But before I could yank it, the sound hit us. As this thing climbed up the steep bank, pushing through brush and small trees, it began to vocalize. I've been in these woods my entire life. I've heard every animal that lives here, coyotes, bobcats, owls, you name it. This was like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It started as a deep, guttural growl that rose into a scream, not high-pitched like a woman screaming, but harsh and deep, like it was being ripped from the creature's chest. The sound echoed across the water and seemed to vibrate right through me. It wasn't just loud, it felt aggressive, almost warning. Sarah started crying beside me. I finally got the motor started and steered us away from the bank, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the tiller. The creature continued up the slope, moving faster than something that size should be able to, crashing through vegetation and snapping branches that sounded like gunshots in the morning quiet. The screaming continued, changing pitch and tone as it moved further up the bank and into the tree line. It wasn't a continuous sound, but came in bursts, like it was calling or warning something else. We could still hear it, even when we couldn't see it anymore through the trees. I gunned the motor to full speed, not caring about our jugs still in the water or the fish we'd caught. I just wanted distance between us and whatever that thing was. The sounds continued for another minute or so until they faded, either because it had moved deeper into the forest or because we'd gotten far enough away. We didn't speak for a long time. I drove the boat in a wide loop to collect our jugs because, honestly, I didn't know what else to do. My mind was racing. Should we call someone? Who would we even call? The game warden, the police? And what would we say? That we saw some kind of massive, hairy creature by the river? I'd grown up hearing stories from old-timers about strange things in these woods, but I'd always written them off as tall tales meant to scare kids. "What was that?" Sarah finally asked, her voice barely audible over the motor. I could see she was still trembling. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "I honestly don't know." We finished collecting our jugs in silence. Every sound from the shoreline made us both jump. Every shadow among the trees seemed to move. We had caught 5 decent-sized catfish, but neither of us cared anymore. The ride back to the boat ramp was tense. We kept looking over our shoulders, scanning the shoreline for any movement. When we finally got the boat on the trailer and were driving home, Sarah broke down. "We can't tell anyone," she said between sobs. "They'll think we're crazy or drunk or making it up." I agreed with her then, and for the most part, we've kept that promise. We told our closest friends we'd had a scare with an aggressive bear just to explain why we seemed so shaken up. But we never told them what we really saw. We still fish that river. We're not going to let one experience, no matter how terrifying, take that away from us, but we never go near that specific stretch of bank anymore. We stay in the middle of the river when we have to pass by it, and we're always listening, always watching the shoreline. Sometimes at night I still hear that scream in my dreams. It's not something you forget. It's not something that fits into any normal framework of the world as I understood it before that day. I've spent countless hours since then researching online, trying to find explanations or similar accounts. I've found some, enough to know we're not alone in what we experienced, but not enough to make me feel any better about it. I'm sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else has seen something similar in that area. We still live nearby, and we still fish those waters. Every time we go out, there's this moment when we both scan the shoreline, not saying anything but both thinking the same thing. Is it still out there? And if it is, what exactly is it? I don't have answers. All I have is what we saw that July morning in 2011. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that has made me question everything I thought I knew about the world around me. Something that was massive, powerful, and very, very real. The thing that haunts me most isn't just the memory of what it looked like or sounded like. It's the certainty I felt in that moment, the absolute knowledge that it was aware of us in the same way we were aware of it. That wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. Whatever was staring at us from that riverbank knew exactly what we were. And sometimes, when we're on the river and the evening gets quiet, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting, and maybe, just maybe, remembering us too. Story 12. I've been holding this in for over a decade now. I never told anyone except my wife about what happened that night in May 2012. And even she thinks I'm exaggerating or that my mind played tricks on me. Maybe writing this out will help me process it. I don't know. All I know is that what I saw was real, and I can't explain it. I was driving home after visiting my brother in Columbus. It was a Friday night, probably around 11:30. I remember because I'd stayed for dinner, and we had a few beers watching the Reds game, which went into extra innings. I left later than I planned to, around 9:30, for the 2-hour drive back to my place near Ironton. The quickest route home takes you along the eastern edge of Wayne National Forest. Anyone from southern Ohio knows those roads. Narrow, winding and pitch black at night. No streetlights, hardly any houses, just miles of dense forest on both sides. Cell reception is spotty at best. I'd driven that route hundreds of times and never had any issues beyond the occasional deer jumping out. That night was unusually warm for May. I remember having my windows cracked, and there was this heavy, damp smell in the air like it might rain. The moon was barely visible through patchy clouds, and I hadn't passed another car for at least 20 minutes. I was about 40 minutes from home, in one of the most isolated stretches of road that cuts through the forest. I wasn't tired or anything. Those beers had worn off hours ago, and I'd had coffee before leaving my brother's place. My mind was clear, just focused on getting home where my wife was waiting up for me. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station that kept cutting out between the hills. It happened so fast that I'm still not sure of the exact sequence. I came around a bend in the road, and my headlights swept across something moving from the left side of the road to the right. At first, I thought it was a bear. We have black bears in Wayne National, though they're pretty rare to spot. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing when I realized whatever it was stood upright, walking on 2 legs. I hit the brakes instinctively. My truck skidded slightly on the asphalt, and I came to a stop maybe 30 feet from where this thing was crossing. The headlights illuminated it perfectly, and that's when I realized I was looking at something I couldn't explain. It was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say it stood between 7 and 8 feet tall. It had broad shoulders, probably twice the width of mine, and I'm not a small guy. Its body was covered in dark hair, sort of a deep brown or black that looked matted in places. But it wasn't like the fur you'd see on a bear. It was more uneven, patchy in some areas, thicker in others, especially around the shoulders and back. What froze me in place wasn't its size, though. It was when it turned toward my truck and I saw its face in the headlights. I can close my eyes right now and still see every detail. The skin was this strange grayish-brown color with a texture that reminded me of old leather left out in the sun too long. The hair on its face wasn't evenly distributed. It was thinner around the cheeks and forehead, which let me see more of the actual skin. It had this heavy brow ridge that cast shadows over its eyes, making them look sunken into its face. Those eyes, they reflected yellow in my headlights, like when you catch a deer or coyote at night, but bigger and somehow more aware. They weren't animal eyes, not exactly. There was something behind them that I can't put into words, a kind of intelligence or awareness that made my blood run cold. Its nose was wide and flat, with large nostrils that seemed to flare slightly as it looked at me. The mouth was wide too, with these thick lips pressed together, not showing any teeth. The jaw was square and powerful looking, like it could crush bones without much effort. The whole face had this weathered appearance, like something that had seen years of harsh conditions. There were creases around the eyes and mouth that gave it an aged look. Along its jawline and chin, it had tufts of softer-looking hair, almost like a patchy beard, and more on the crown of its head. We locked eyes for maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt like minutes. I couldn't move. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel, and I was barely breathing. I remember the sound of my engine idling and nothing else. No forest noises, no wind, just complete silence otherwise. It was like everything in the woods had gone quiet. Then it just continued walking. No rush, no apparent fear of me or my truck. It moved with this fluid stride that was both human-like and not. Its arms were longer than a person's should be, swinging slightly as it walked. It crossed the road completely and disappeared into the tree line on the right side. I sat there for what must have been several minutes, unable to process what I'd just seen. My first instinct was to throw the truck in reverse and get the hell out of there. But the road was too narrow for a quick turnaround. Going back meant another hour added to my drive, and whatever that thing was, it had walked away from me, not toward me. I remember fumbling for my phone to try to call my wife, but as expected, there was no signal. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold it anyway. I finally put the truck in drive and slowly continued forward, past the spot where it had crossed. I had this overwhelming feeling that it was still watching me from somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees. The rest of the drive home is a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced I'd see it following me or darting across the road again. Every shadow seemed to move. Every tree branch looked like a reaching arm. I've never driven so carefully yet, so desperately in my life. When I got home, my wife said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I tried to explain what happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you describe something you've never seen before and have no reference point for? I ended up telling her I'd nearly hit a really big animal, and it scared me, which was true enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes reflecting in my headlights, that face turning toward me. I got up around 3 in the morning and started researching on the internet. I typed in things like tall, hairy creature Ohio and humanoid forest sightings. That's when I started reading about Bigfoot and Sasquatch encounters. But here's the thing, what I saw doesn't quite match the typical descriptions. Most Bigfoot sightings describe something very ape-like, almost completely covered in hair. What I saw had that exposed skin on its face, those reflective eyes, that weathered, almost human-like facial structure. It seemed older, somehow, more evolved or developed than what people typically describe. The next day, I drove back to that stretch of road in broad daylight. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints, broken branches, some evidence that I hadn't imagined the whole thing, but there was nothing obvious. The ground on either side of the road was covered in leaves and underbrush that didn't show clear tracks. I walked a little way into the woods on the side where it had disappeared, but felt too uneasy to go far. The forest seemed normal in daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the following weeks, I went down a rabbit hole of research. I read about every cryptid and unexplained creature sighting in Ohio and the surrounding states. I found some accounts that had similarities: the height, the general build, the way it walked, but nothing that matched the face I saw exactly. I considered reporting it to someone, but who? The local police would think I was crazy or drunk. Wildlife authorities would dismiss it as a bear sighting by someone who was tired and seeing things. There are some Bigfoot research groups, but I was afraid of becoming that guy, the local nut who claims he saw a monster in the woods. For months afterward, I avoided driving that road at night. I'd take the longer route home, adding almost an hour to my drive just to stay on more populated highways. When I finally did drive through that area again after dark, I kept my high beams on the entire time and drove well above the speed limit. It's been over 10 years now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I almost convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, A combination of fatigue and shadows, and maybe a bear that my brain turned into something more fantastic. But then I remember those eyes looking directly into mine, the deliberate way it turned its head toward me, and I know what I saw was real. I've lived in southern Ohio most of my life. I know what bears look like, what deer look like, what every normal animal in these woods looks like. This wasn't any of those. It wasn't a person in a costume either. No costume could capture the subtle movements of the facial features, the natural way the hair grew patchier in some areas than others, the weathered texture of the skin. To this day, I still get uneasy driving through isolated wooded areas at night. I keep expecting to catch a glimpse of that figure crossing the road ahead of me, to see those yellow eyes reflecting in my headlights again. I don't know what it was. Bigfoot, some unknown species, or something else entirely. All I know is that for a few brief seconds on a dark road in Wayne National Forest, I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that has no place in our understanding of the natural world. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night and the house is completely quiet, I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 13. I've never told many people about what happened that night in spring 2007. Most wouldn't believe me, and honestly, I'm not sure I would believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But it's been 16 years now, and I still remember every detail like it happened yesterday. I was 17 back then, just a few months away from graduating high school. My best friend Jake and I were driving out to Whiteman Air Force Base one night in his mom's old Dodge Caravan. His dad worked as a contractor at one of the maintenance shops on base, and Jake needed to pick up some travel documents for a family trip they were planning. It was just after 9 o'clock at night. The weather was miserable, that damp, bone-chilling Missouri cold that comes after rain. It had been showering on and off all day, and everything was wet and slick. The kind of night where you just want to be home in front of the TV, not driving around in the middle of nowhere. The access road that loops around the base perimeter is seriously creepy at night. It's this narrow blacktop with these deep drainage ditches on both sides. Beyond that are just open fields that stretch out into darkness. There are security lights along the fence in some places, but they just make the darkness beyond them seem even darker, you know? We hadn't seen another car since we turned onto the access road. Jake was driving slow, maybe 20-25 mph, because the road was wet and it was so dark. He was talking about some girl from chemistry class. He was trying to work up the courage to ask to prom. I was only half listening, mostly just staring out the passenger window at the empty fields. That's when I first noticed it. Something moving in the darkness alongside the van. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a reflection from the security lights playing tricks on me. But then I realized whatever it was keeping pace with us. Consistently. Not falling behind, not getting ahead, just matching our speed exactly. I leaned closer to the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and that's when my blood went cold. There was something running through the edge of the plowed field about 15 yards away from us, running on two legs, running at 20-25 mph through rough, muddy terrain like it was nothing. I couldn't speak. I literally couldn't get words to come out of my mouth. Jake was still talking about his crush, completely oblivious to what was happening on my side of the van, and I'm just sitting there, frozen, watching this thing keeping pace with us. It wasn't running like a person. The stride was different, powerful, smooth. It wasn't bobbing up and down like humans do when they run. Its movement was fluid but heavy, like it had significant weight behind each step. And its arms, God, its arms were so long, swinging with each stride and reaching almost to its knees. Under the occasional security light, I could see it was covered in dark fur, black mostly, but with what looked like brown highlights where the light caught the tips. It was tall, taller than any man I've ever known. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Broad chest and shoulders, thick legs. It was propelling itself forward without any visible effort while we were in a vehicle going 20-25 mph. And then it happened. As if it could feel me staring, the thing turned its head and looked directly at me through the window. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It was dark beneath thick hair, with eyes set deep under a heavy brow ridge. It had a wide, flat nose and a closed mouth. What struck me the most was its expression, or rather, the lack of one. It wasn't threatening or scared, it was just neutral. Like my presence didn't matter at all. The hair around its face was shorter than on its body, but still thick. For what felt like forever, but was probably only about 10 seconds, we locked eyes while it continued running alongside us without breaking stride. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move, I could only stare. Then, as we approached a curve where the road dipped closer to the fence line, it suddenly veered off into the darkness. It disappeared into the brush like nothing could slow it down. Not the terrain, not the darkness, nothing. Jake was still talking, completely unaware of what had just happened. I finally managed to croak out, "Did you see that?" "See what?" he asked, glancing over at me. I tried to explain, but the words sounded crazy even as I said them. There was something running beside the van, something big, like really big. Jake laughed. "What, like a deer or something?" "No," I said. "It was on 2 legs. It was... I don't know what it was." He slowed down the van and looked out my window, but of course, there was nothing to see now. "You're messing with me, right?" I shook my head. "I'm serious. It was right there, keeping pace with us. It looked at me." Jake could tell from my face that I wasn't joking. "Well, what did it look like then?" "It was covered in dark fur, black, maybe dark brown in places. It was tall, man, like really tall, and it had these long arms." Jake's expression changed from amusement to concern. "You're freaking me out, Tyler." By then we were pulling up to the maintenance shed where his dad worked. There were a couple of security lights illuminating the parking area, but beyond that was just darkness. The thought of getting out of the van made my stomach turn. "I'll just wait here," I told Jake. "You go get the documents." "You're seriously not coming in?" he asked. I shook my head. "No way, I'm staying right here." Jake hesitated. "Is this about that thing you think you saw?" "I didn't think I saw it," I insisted. "I saw it, clear as day. It was real, Jake." He gave me a long look, then sighed. "Fine, lock the doors. I'll be right back." As soon as Jake shut the driver's door, I reached over and locked all the doors. Then I adjusted the side mirrors so I could see as much of the area around the van as possible. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the controls. I kept scanning the darkness beyond the security lights, convinced that at any moment I'd see that thing emerge from the shadows. Every few seconds, I'd check a different mirror or window. My heart was racing, and I was sweating despite the cold. Jake was only gone for maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When he finally came back and knocked on the driver's window, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I quickly unlocked the doors. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said as he climbed in. "Worse," I replied. On the drive back, I tried to explain in more detail what I'd seen. Jake listened more seriously this time, asking questions. "Could it have been a guy in a costume?" he asked. "No way," I said. "No human could run that fast on that terrain, and the way it moved, it wasn't like a person in a suit. It was too fluid, too natural. Maybe it was a bear. They can stand on their hind legs." I shook my head. It wasn't standing occasionally. It was running upright the whole time. Bears don't do that, and the proportions were all wrong for a bear. "What about a trick of the light, or shadows from the security lights?" "Shadows don't turn their heads and look you in the eye, Jake." He fell silent for a minute. "So what do you think it was?" I hesitated. The word seemed ridiculous to say out loud. I think it might have been a Bigfoot." I expected him to laugh, but he didn't. He just gripped the steering wheel tighter and drove a little faster. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise outside my window would jolt me awake. I'd lie there in the dark, convinced that if I looked outside, I'd see that face staring back at me. The neutral expression, those deep-set eyes, like I was being observed by something that didn't see me as a threat or as prey, just as something to be noted and then dismissed. I tried researching online, looking for similar sightings around Whiteman Air Force Base. There were a few vague stories from hunters and people who lived in the rural areas around there, but nothing specific enough to confirm what I'd seen. I even considered reporting it to some Bigfoot research group, but I was afraid of being mocked or becoming some kind of local joke, so I mostly kept it to myself. Jake and I didn't talk about it much after that night. I think he still believes I saw something, but he's not convinced it was what I think it was. And honestly, sometimes I wonder myself. The human mind can play tricks, especially in the dark. But then I'll catch some documentary or video footage of a supposed Bigfoot, and I'll recognize that gait, that distinctive way of moving, the proportions, the long arms, the broad shoulders, the smooth stride, and I'll know in my gut that what I saw that night was real. What bothers me most, even after all these years, isn't the fear I felt. It's the indifference in its eyes when it looked at me. There was intelligence there, but no concern about being seen. Like we were so inconsequential that our awareness of its existence didn't matter at all. Sometimes I wonder how many times these things have been right next to us, just beyond the reach of our headlights or just outside our peripheral vision, watching us while we remain completely unaware. How many times have they kept pace with our cars on dark roads or observed us from the edges of forests while we camped or hiked? I can't explain what I saw that night. I can't prove it was real. All I know is that my perception of the world changed forever in those few seconds when something impossible ran beside our van and turned to look at me. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that shares this world with us, but lives just beyond the edges of our awareness. And sometimes on dark nights when I'm driving alone on rural roads, I can't help but glance at my side mirrors a little more often than necessary. Because deep down, I know they're out there, and I know they're watching. Story 14. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family, partly because I don't want people thinking I'm crazy, and partly because I still get goosebumps just thinking about it, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. This happened about 6 years ago at Delta Lake in upstate New York. I've been fishing that lake since I was a kid. My dad taught me how to cast a line there when I was 8, and I've probably spent thousands of hours on those shores over my lifetime. I know every inlet, every good spot, especially where the Mohawk River feeds into the lake. That was always my favorite fishing spot until that day. My buddy Tom and I had planned a full day of fishing. We'd been looking forward to it for weeks. The weather was perfect, not too hot, clear skies, just a slight breeze. We arrived early, around 6 in the morning, and set up at our usual spot where the river meets the lake. It's slightly secluded, with trees on 3 sides creating a small clearing that opens to the water. You have to hike about 20 minutes from the main parking area to get there, which is why we liked it. Fewer people, more fish. The day was going great. We'd caught several bass and a couple decent-sized walleye. We had our cooler filled with beer and sandwiches, and time just flew by. Before we knew it, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. "Should we pack up?" Tom asked, checking his watch. I looked at my line in the water and felt that familiar fisherman's urge. Just one more cast. "Let's stay a bit longer," I said. "Fish are really biting now with the evening cool coming in." Tom shrugged and cracked open another beer. "Fine by me." That decision still haunts me. As the sun started setting, the temperature dropped a few degrees. The light took on that golden quality it gets right before sunset, making everything look almost unnaturally vivid. We were both quiet, focused on our lines, enjoying the peace. That's when I first noticed something was off. The normal evening sounds, the steady chirping of crickets, the rhythmic croaking of frogs along the shoreline. They just stopped, not gradually fading away, but a sudden absence, like someone had hit mute on nature's soundtrack. I remember looking up from my line, making eye contact with Tom. He'd noticed it too. "That's weird," he whispered, though I don't know why he was whispering. There was nobody else around for at least a mile. Then we heard it, from across the river, maybe 100 yards away in the thick brush on the opposite bank, breathing. Heavy, slow, deliberate breathing, not like an animal panting, but more controlled, deeper, more purposeful. "Bear," Tom mouthed silently. I shook my head. "I've encountered black bears while fishing before. They don't breathe like that, and they make noise moving through brush. This breathing was coming from something stationary, something watching." We both turned toward the sound, straining to see across the river in the fading light. The tree line on the far bank was dense, creating deep shadows that seemed to swallow the last rays of sunlight. The breathing continued, steady and unsettling. Then it started moving, parallel to the riverbank at first, still hidden in the brush, but definitely moving. I could track its progress by the sound and the slight movement of branches. Whatever it was big. Then the birds started. Dozens of them suddenly burst from the trees across the river, flying away from whatever was moving there. Not in a normal, casual flight pattern, but in panic, chaotic, desperate, getting away from something that scared them. "Frank," Tom said, his voice tight, "I think we should go." I nodded, but neither of us moved yet. There was something hypnotic about trying to spot what was making that sound, trying to make sense of what was happening. The breathing got louder, closer to the river's edge now. It was accompanied by the sound of branches snapping, not small twigs, but substantial branches breaking under significant weight. The brush on the far side began shaking violently. Whatever it was coming toward the water. My heart was hammering in my chest. The air felt electric, charged with a kind of primal fear I'd never experienced before. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I remained frozen, staring into the darkening tree line. Then it happened. A tremendous splash hit the water, not like something diving in smoothly, but like something massive had stepped or fallen into the river. The splash was so powerful that waves rippled across to our side, lapping at the shore by our feet. That broke the spell. Without a word, Tom and I began packing our gear. Not running, not panicking outwardly, but moving with deliberate speed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely reel in my line. I dropped my tackle box twice, spilling lures across the ground. I left some behind. I didn't care. The breathing continued, now from the water. Whatever it was in the river, coming toward us. I didn't wait to find out. We shouldered our gear and began walking, then speed walking, then almost jogging, back toward the trail that led to the parking lot. Neither of us looked back. Neither of us spoke. We just moved. The entire time, I felt it watching us. I can't explain how I knew, but I could physically feel its gaze on my back, like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades. The sensation was so intense that several times I nearly turned around, convinced I would see something right behind me. But fear kept my head facing forward. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot, the lights from the nearby ranger station visible through the trees, that we finally stopped and looked at each other. What the hell was that? Tom's face was pale, his forehead beaded with sweat despite the cool evening air. "I don't know," I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. "A bear, maybe." But I didn't believe that. Not for a second. Bears don't make the entire forest go silent. They don't cause birds to flee in terror, and they don't breathe like that, like something almost human but much, much larger. We loaded our gear in silence and drove home. We talked about it briefly that night, both of us downplaying what happened, trying to rationalize it. Tom suggested it was probably a moose, though moose are rare in that part of New York. I nodded along, grateful for any explanation that didn't lead to more disturbing possibilities. But I knew better. I've spent my whole life in those woods. I know what belongs there and what doesn't. What we experienced that evening wasn't natural. It wasn't something I could file away in my understanding of the local wildlife. Over the following weeks, I researched local animal species, trying to match anything to what we'd heard. Nothing fit. I even looked into local legends and folklore, which led me down a rabbit hole of Bigfoot sightings in upstate New York. I'd always scoffed at those stories before. I don't scoff anymore. The most unsettling part? 3 days after our experience, I drove back to the lake in broad daylight. I needed to convince myself it was nothing, that in the evening light and silence, my imagination had simply run wild. I parked at the lot and started down the trail toward our fishing spot. I made it about halfway before stopping. That feeling of being watched returned, so intense that my skin broke out in goosebumps despite the warm sun. The forest seemed to go quiet again. Though I told myself it was just my paranoia, I turned around and walked back to my car. I haven't returned to that specific spot since. Tom and I still fish Delta Lake occasionally, but always at the public areas, never back to our secluded spot where the Mohawk feeds in. We've never directly discussed why. It's like an unspoken agreement between us. Sometimes when we're fishing at other spots on the lake, I'll catch Tom staring across the water toward that area, a distant look in his eyes. I know he's thinking about it too, about the breathing, about what made that splash, about what might have happened if we'd stayed just a little longer. I never actually saw anything that day. No definitive proof of what was watching us from across the river, but I don't need visual confirmation to know what I experienced. Something was there. Something big enough to make substantial branches snap under its weight. Something that moved with purpose and intelligence. Something that didn't belong. I've been an outdoorsman all my life. I've encountered bears, coyotes, bobcats, and every other predator native to upstate New York. None of them ever made me feel the way I felt that evening, like I was being hunted, studied by something that shouldn't exist. The rational part of my brain still tries to explain it away. Maybe it was some combination of natural phenomena that created a perfect storm of misinterpretation. Maybe the isolation and gathering darkness played tricks on us. But then I remember the absolute silence that fell over the forest. I remember the panicked flight of the birds. I remember that breathing, deep, rhythmic, almost deliberate, and the massive splash that sent waves across the river to our feet. I don't know what was watching us from the tree line that evening at Delta Lake. I don't want to know. But whatever it was, it changed something fundamental in how I view the forests I grew up in. There are places I won't go anymore. Times of day when I won't be caught in certain areas. The wilderness I once found so familiar now holds secrets I'm not eager to uncover. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my backyard at night and the wind rustles through the trees just right, I swear I can hear it again. That slow, heavy breathing coming from just beyond the light. Story 15. I've been a courier for 13 years now, and I've seen some weird stuff on my routes. Naked people answering doors, drug deals happening right in front of me while I'm waiting for signatures, even walked up on what I'm pretty sure was a cult meeting once in rural Vermont. But what happened to me in April of 2009 still gives me nightmares. And I've never told anyone except my wife because I know how it sounds. I drive for one of the big delivery companies, not saying which one for obvious reasons, and I've had the same route in Western Massachusetts for almost a decade. I know most of the regulars on my route, and I'm familiar with all the back roads and shortcuts. That day started like any other. I loaded my truck at the depot in Springfield at 5:30 in the morning, went through my usual stops in the more populated areas first, then headed out to the rural deliveries. Around 2 in the afternoon, I had a package for a house I'd only delivered to maybe twice before. It was this really remote place outside Westfield, at the end of this long dirt road that branched off another dirt road. The kind of place where your GPS gives up and just says, good luck. The package wasn't anything special. Medium-sized box, not too heavy, probably just something from Amazon. It had been raining on and off all day, but when I pulled up to the turnoff for this property, the sun had come out. The whole place was super quiet, that deep country quiet that city people don't understand. The driveway was actually more like a small road, probably a quarter-mile long with woods on both sides, before opening up to a clearing with the house and a horse pasture. I remember it was unseasonably warm for April in Massachusetts. I had my window down and was actually enjoying the fresh air. The trees were just starting to bud, and everything had that bright green spring look. I could see the horses in the field as I drove up. 4 or 5 of them just doing horse things, grazing near the fence closest to the house. I parked in front of the house and grabbed the package. Nothing seemed off at first. The house was this older farmhouse with a big covered porch. As I was walking up the gravel driveway, I noticed something weird. There was a big flock of birds, looked like crows or ravens, suddenly bursting out of a patch of woods on the left side of the property. You know how birds normally fly up in a pattern? These weren't doing that. They were scattering in all directions like something had scared the hell out of them. I didn't think much of it until I saw the horses. They'd been calm when I pulled in, but now they were all looking in the same direction, toward that same patch of woods. Then they just took off running to the far side of their field, not trotting, not casually moving, full-on galloping like they were terrified. I even saw a couple deer bolt from the tree line and race across the open field away from those woods. I remember thinking, that's weird, but figured maybe there was a coyote or something. I got to the door and rang the bell. No answer. I knocked a couple times, but still nothing. I was about to leave the package. It didn't need a signature. When I heard it, I still don't know how to describe this sound. It was like a growl, but not like any animal I've ever heard. It was deep, so deep I could feel it in my chest, but it also had this roaring quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't super loud, but it carried across the property like it was right behind me. I froze on that porch for what felt like forever. That's when I saw movement in the woods where the birds had flown from. The trees were thick, but I could see branches shaking, not like when there's wind. These were moving like something big was pushing through them. Small pine trees were bending and snapping back. Whatever was in there was huge. I'm not a small guy, 6 foot 200 pounds, but what I saw next made me feel tiny. It never fully came out into the open, but I could see parts of it through gaps in the trees as it moved along the edge of the woods. It was standing upright, not hunched over like a bear might be, fully upright and walking on 2 legs. All I could make out were these glimpses of dark hair or fur, but I could tell it was massive, wide across the shoulders and tall, really tall. The tops of smaller trees were moving as it passed them, and these weren't saplings. I'm guessing it had to be over 7 feet, maybe closer to 8. I've hunted my whole life. I know what bears look like. I know what moose look like. This wasn't either of those. The way it moved was too fluid, too purposeful, and the proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung much lower than any human's would, and its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders with barely any neck. I stood there frozen, clutching this stupid package for maybe 30 seconds before my brain kicked back in. The horses were still freaking out, pressed against the far fence like they were trying to phase through it. I didn't run, not at first. I was afraid running might trigger whatever it was to chase me, so I backed up slowly, trying to keep my eyes on the tree line while making my way back to the truck. I'd made it about halfway when it roared again, louder this time, closer. That's when I ran. I don't think I've ever moved that fast in my life. I threw the package in the passenger seat, slammed the door, and started the engine in one motion. As I was turning around in the driveway, I got one more glimpse toward the woods. Something dark had moved to a different spot along the tree line, still partially hidden, but definitely watching me. I drove out of there so fast, I nearly bottomed out my suspension on the rutted driveway. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, and even then I kept checking my mirrors like it might be following me. I called my supervisor and told him I couldn't deliver the package because no one was home. I didn't mention anything else. What was I going to say? Hey, I think I saw Bigfoot. I'd have been drug tested or fired on the spot. The thing is, I still had to deliver that package. Company policy is to attempt delivery the next day if the customer doesn't specify another option. So the next morning, I had to go back. I almost called in sick, but I needed the job and figured whatever I saw would be long gone. This time I went earlier, around 10 in the morning. The weather was totally different, overcast and cooler. When I pulled up, the owner was actually outside, working on a tractor in the yard. He was this older guy, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and calloused hands. The kind of guy who spent his whole life working outdoors. I handed him the package, and he thanked me. I almost left it at that, but something made me ask, "Hey, do you ever have problems with, wildlife around here?" He gave me this look, not suspicious, but curious. "What kind of wildlife you talking about?" I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "I was out here yesterday, but no one was home. I noticed your horses seemed pretty spooked by something in the woods over there." His expression changed immediately. "Yeah, they've been jumpy lately. Been hearing some strange noises at night the past few weeks. Thought it might be coyotes at first, but..." He trailed off, looking toward that same patch of woods. "But what?" I asked. He seemed to debate whether to continue, then said, "Friend of mine has a hunting dog. Good dog, experienced. He brought him out here 3 weeks ago to train him. Dog caught a scent in those woods and took off after it. My friend found him the next morning." "Was he okay?" I asked, though I could tell from his face what the answer would be. "Neck was broken. Whatever did it was strong enough to snap the spine of a 90-pound hunting dog." He shook his head. "Game warden said it was probably a bobcat, but I've never known a bobcat to do that kind of damage." I wanted to tell him what I'd seen, but I couldn't make myself say it. Instead, I just nodded and said I hoped whatever it was moved on soon. As I was getting back in my truck, he called out, "Whatever's out there, it's been making these sounds at night. Not like any animal I've heard before, low and deep, almost like..." He paused, seeming embarrassed. "Almost like it's trying to talk." I've never gone back to that house. I requested a route change about a month later, citing the long drive times to that area. My supervisor approved it without question. I've never told anyone at work what happened. I did look up Sasquatch sightings in western Massachusetts when I got home that day, and there have been dozens reported over the years, mostly in the more remote areas along the New York border. I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. But I do know that the fear I felt that day was different from anything I've ever experienced. It wasn't just being scared of an animal. It was deeper than that. It was the feeling of suddenly realizing you're not at the top of the food chain, that there are things in this world we don't understand and maybe aren't meant to. I still drive for the same company, still deliver packages to rural areas, but now I always stay in my truck until I'm sure someone's home, and I never ever linger when I'm at a delivery in the woods. Some things you only need to experience once to know you never want to experience them again. Story 16. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that Halloween night in 2006. It's been years, but I can close my eyes and see every detail like it happened yesterday. I've never really talked about this with many people who would believe me anyway, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. That night started normal enough. My little brother Ethan was 15 at the time, and he'd been begging me to drop him off at Foster Lake near Sweet Home, where all the high school kids were gathering to tell ghost stories. I was 22, home from college for the weekend, and honestly just wanted to chill at home watching horror movies, but Mom insisted I drive him. "It's Halloween, Alex," she said. "Let him have some fun with his friends." The evening was chilly, that crisp October cold that makes the air feel sharp in your lungs. I remember wearing my old Oregon State hoodie and cranking the heat in my beat-up Ford Explorer. Ethan was rambling about some girl he liked who would be at the lake, barely taking a breath between sentences. We arrived around 8:30. The gathering spot was this clearing near the west side of the lake, where kids had already set up a small bonfire. I could see maybe 15 teenagers huddled around, their faces lit up orange by the flames. The whole scene was exactly what you'd expect. Kids trying to scare each other, couples sneaking off into the shadows, typical Halloween stuff. "Text me when you want to be picked up," I told Ethan. "I'll be home watching The Shining." "I'll get a ride," he said, already halfway out the door. "No, you won't. Text me." I was firm on this. Our parents would kill me if I let him ride with some teenager who'd probably been drinking. He rolled his eyes but agreed, then jogged over to join his friends. I watched for a minute, making sure he was actually with people he knew, then turned the Explorer around to head home. This is where everything changed. The park road crosses over this small inlet on the northeast side of the lake. It's not even a proper bridge, just a raised section of road with a culvert underneath, where water flows from a creek into the main lake. The road there is lined with these tall Douglas firs that block out most of the moonlight, making it pitch black, except for my headlights. I was maybe halfway across this section when my headlights swept across something at the edge of the creek, about 20 yards downstream to my right. At first I thought it was a bear. We get black bears around there sometimes, but something felt off immediately. The shape was wrong. I slowed down, trying to get a better look, but the angle was bad. Without really thinking, I pulled over to the shoulder, put the Explorer in reverse, and backed up until I was at a better vantage point. I killed the engine but left the headlights on, pointing directly at where I'd seen the movement. What I saw next still makes my stomach drop. There was this figure crouched at the water's edge, not standing, but squatting down on its haunches. Its hands, and they were definitely hands, not paws, were moving just under the surface of the water, like it was feeling for something, fishing maybe. The fur on it looked dark and wet in my headlights. A deep brown or maybe black, hard to tell exactly. But what struck me was how it clumped together in these thick mats, especially around the shoulders and upper back. Not like a bear's fur at all. Even in that crouched position, the thing was massive. Its shoulders had to be 4.5 to 5 feet off the ground, with this incredibly wide back that tapered down to a narrower waist. The proportions were all wrong for any animal I knew. I remember my mouth going completely dry. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I couldn't even reach for my phone to take a picture. I was completely frozen. Then it moved. It must have sensed my presence somehow. I don't know if it heard the car engine stop or what, but it suddenly went completely still. Then, very slowly, it turned its head partially toward me. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was still mostly in profile, but I caught a glimpse of this massive brow ridge and what looked like eyes reflecting my headlights for just a second. That's when my brain finally processed what I was seeing. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't anything I recognized. Then it stood up. Jesus Christ, the way it unfolded itself from that crouching position. It rose up and up and up. Its movements were smooth, not jerky like you'd expect from something that big. When it straightened to its full height, I realized I was looking at something that had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its head would have been well above the roof of my Explorer if it had stood next to it. The proportions were unmistakably humanoid, but wrong. The arms hung way too long, reaching almost to its knees. The shoulders were impossibly broad, and the neck seemed almost non-existent, with the head sitting directly on those massive shoulders. For what felt like forever, but was probably just seconds, it stood there, still partially turned toward me. Then, in 3 or 4 steps, it crossed the creek, a creek that would have come up to my waist at its deepest point, like it was nothing more than a puddle. What really got me was how it climbed the opposite bank. It didn't use its hands at all. It just walked up this steep, muddy incline like it was taking a stroll on flat ground. No struggling for footing, no grabbing at roots or branches, just this powerful, deliberate movement. Then it was gone, disappearing into the brush on the other side. No crashing sounds, no breaking branches. It moved through dense undergrowth more silently than I could walk across my carpeted bedroom. I sat there for I don't know how long, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mind kept trying to rationalize what I'd seen. A bear standing on its hind legs. No way. Some guy in a costume. On Halloween night maybe, but no costume could move like that. No human could be that tall or move with that kind of fluid power. When I finally got my shit together enough to start the car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice. I drove home going about 15 miles per hour the whole way, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the tree line along the road. I didn't tell anyone that night. Not my parents, not my brother when I eventually went back to pick him up. He texted around 11, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when my phone buzzed. How do you even start that conversation? Hey, by the way, I think I just saw Bigfoot fishing in the creek, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I made up some excuse about leaving my sunglasses at the lake and drove back to that same spot in broad daylight. What I found didn't make me feel any better. The creek bank where the thing had been crouching had these wide depressions in the mud. Not distinct footprints, but areas where something heavy had pressed down. The vegetation was disturbed in a way that seemed deliberate, not like when deer or elk move through. On the opposite bank, where it had climbed up, I found broken branches and bent saplings, not snapped cleanly like someone had used a tool, but twisted and pushed aside with tremendous force. Some of the breaks were a good 7 feet off the ground, but what really haunts me is how close this thing was to civilization. There are street lamps along the park entrance road less than a quarter mile away. Behind the trees on the far side of the creek are houses. Actual neighborhoods where people were probably handing out candy to trick-or-treaters, while this thing was just there. The town of Sweet Home itself is less than a mile from that spot, and it seemed completely unbothered by my presence. Not afraid, not aggressive, just momentarily curious before going about its business. Like I wasn't worth its attention. I've spent countless hours researching since then. I've read every book and article I could find about Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. I've gone down internet rabbit holes and joined forums like this one. I've learned that the Foster Lake area has had sporadic reports over the years. Nothing major, just occasional odd sightings or strange sounds at night. But none of that research has helped me make sense of what I saw. The creature's proximity to town, its apparent comfort being so close to human activity, the deliberate way it seemed to be fishing. It goes against so much of what I've read about these beings supposedly avoiding human contact at all costs. I've gone back to that spot dozens of times over the years, never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if my mind played some elaborate Halloween trick on me. But then I remember the physical evidence I found the next day and the way my body reacted. That primal fear response isn't something you can fake to yourself. I still live in Oregon, not far from Sweet Home. Sometimes when I drive past Foster Lake at night, I slow down at that same stretch of road, scanning the creek bank with my headlights. Part of me hopes I'll see it again, just to confirm I'm not crazy. A bigger part of me hopes I never do. Whatever I saw that Halloween night doesn't fit into my understanding of the world. It exists in this uncomfortable space between known and unknown, and I don't think I'll ever be able to fully explain it. All I know is that something was there, something intelligent and powerful that doesn't appear in any biology textbook, and it's probably still out there. Story 17. I'm still not sure if I should be writing this down. My therapist says it might help, but every time I think about what happened that day at Forlorn Lakes, my hands start shaking and I feel that same cold dread creeping up my spine. It's been 8 months, and I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I can hear that heavy breathing just outside my bedroom window. My wife Terry and I used to love camping. We'd go at least once a month during the season, usually up to Forlorn Lakes in Skamania County. It's about a 2-hour drive from our home in Portland, and we knew the area pretty well. We'd been going there for years with our dachshund Barksy. He loved those trips as much as we did. splashing in the shallows, chasing squirrels, curling up between us in the tent at night. This was early October last year. We figured it would be our last camping trip before winter set in. The forecast called for clear skies, but the mountains have their own weather patterns. We arrived around 2 in the afternoon and set up our usual spot, a nice clearing about 50 yards from the lake's edge. We had our routine down pat. Terry would set up the tent while I unpacked the car and got the cooking gear ready. Everything was normal at first. We made dinner as the sun started to set, just some hot dogs and beans, nothing fancy. That's when the fog started rolling in. Not unusual for that time of year, but this fog was different somehow. Thicker. It seemed to swallow the sounds of the forest. The usual chirping of birds and rustling of leaves just stopped. We turned in early that night, around 9. Barksy was restless, which wasn't like him. He kept pacing around the tent, sniffing at the zippers. I remember telling Terry he probably smelled a raccoon outside. We should have paid more attention to his behavior. I woke up around 2 in the morning to Barksy growling. Not his playful growl, but that deep, threatening rumble dogs make when they're genuinely afraid. He was standing rigid at the foot of our sleeping bags, his hackles raised, staring at the tent wall. That's when I noticed the shadow. Something large was moving outside our tent. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd had encounters before and knew to keep our food sealed and hung from trees away from our sight. But this shadow was too tall, too wrong somehow. I crawled over to the tent window and unzipped it just enough to peek out. What I saw made no sense. It looked like a moose, but we don't have moose in that part of Washington. It was tall, with what seemed like antlers or a very large head. The fog had thickened, and all I could make out was this massive silhouette moving around our campsite. Then it knocked over our cooking gear. The clatter made Terry wake up with a start. "What was that?" she whispered. I told her to stay quiet. Whatever it was moved away from our tent, disappearing into the fog. We didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The fog had lifted, and our campsite looked exactly as we'd left it, except our cooking pots and plates were scattered around. Terry suggested it was probably a deer, or maybe a black bear, and I went along with it. Neither of us wanted to admit how unsettled we felt. We decided to take the canoe out on the lake to fish and clear our heads. Barksy came with us, sitting between my feet in the middle of the canoe. We paddled toward the far side of the lake, an area we hadn't explored much before. It was marshy over there, with tall reeds and little islands of mud and grass. The fog started rolling back in around noon, which was weird for that time of day. It came in patches, thick in some areas, while other parts of the lake remained clear. As we drifted into one of these foggy patches, both Terry and I felt suddenly exhausted. Not just tired, but a bone-deep weariness that came out of nowhere. My arms felt too heavy to paddle properly. Terry mentioned feeling the same thing. That's when we saw them. Through a break in the fog, about 50 yards away in the marshy area, 2 large heads. That's the only way I can describe them. They were bearded, massive, and seemed to be floating through the reeds. I couldn't see any bodies below them, no canoe, no movement of arms paddling. They were just gliding through the marsh. Terry gripped my arm so hard it left bruises. "Michael," she whispered, "what are those?" I had no answer. All I knew was that every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from there. Even Barksy, who usually barks at everything, was dead silent, trembling between my feet. We turned the canoe around and paddled back to our campsite as fast as we could. The strange exhaustion vanished as soon as we were out of that foggy patch. Neither of us spoke much for the rest of the afternoon. We busied ourselves with camp chores, but I kept finding myself staring across the lake, watching for movement in the marsh. Terry wanted to pack up and leave. I convinced her to stay one more night, saying it was probably just some local hunters using some kind of marsh boat we couldn't see. I didn't believe that explanation myself, but I wasn't ready to admit what we might have seen. That night was when things got truly terrifying. The fog rolled in again at sunset, thicker than before. We ate dinner in silence and turned in early, both of us exhausted from the stress and lack of sleep. Barksy wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing around the tent, whimpering and scratching at the floor. Around midnight, he suddenly went from anxious to frantic. He started barking and growling at the tent wall, his whole body shaking with fear. That's when I heard it. Heavy breathing, just outside our tent. Not animal breathing. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Something large was moving around our campsite, circling our tent slowly. Then something hit the side of our tent, hard. I jumped up and grabbed my flashlight. Terry was begging me not to look outside, but I had to know what was out there. I unzipped the tent window just enough to shine the light out. For a split second, I saw one of those heads, up close, covered in dark hair, with deep-set eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like a deer's. But these weren't deer eyes. There was intelligence there, awareness. Then it was gone, disappearing into the fog so quickly, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Neither of us slept that night. We sat huddled together in the middle of the tent, Barksy between us, listening to the sounds outside, occasional heavy footsteps, breathing, something dragging through the underbrush. When dawn finally came, the sounds stopped. We waited until full daylight before venturing outside. Everything looked normal again, except for one thing. Our canoe was missing. We'd pulled it up on shore and secured it to a tree with a rope. The rope was still there, cut clean through, but the canoe was gone. We found it about 20 minutes later, partially submerged in the lake about 100 yards from our campsite. It looked like something had tried to sink it by filling it with rocks, but hadn't quite succeeded. Terry was done. She started packing up our gear, saying we needed to leave immediately. I should have listened to her. Instead, I had this overwhelming need to understand what was happening. I convinced her to take one more canoe trip with me, to the opposite shore where we'd seen those things. She only agreed because I promised we'd leave immediately afterward, no matter what we found. We paddled across the lake, Barksy whimpering the whole way. The fog had receded, but patches still hung over the marshy area. When we reached the far shore, what we found chilled me to the bone. There was a crude raft made of logs tied together with twisted reeds and plant fibers. Around it, in the mud, were footprints, enormous barefoot tracks, easily twice the size of my boot. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the mud. I took photos with my phone, though my hands were shaking so badly, most of them came out blurry. Terry was tugging at my arm, begging me to leave. That's when we saw them returning. Two figures on another raft, gliding across the lake toward us from further down the shore. Moving with that same smooth motion we'd seen before, as if they weren't paddling but somehow propelling themselves another way. Through the patchy fog, all I could clearly see were those massive bearded heads. We didn't wait around. We practically jumped into our canoe and paddled back to our campsite with everything we had. I've never moved so fast in my life. We reached our camp, tied the canoe to our car roof without properly securing it, threw our gear into the trunk, and drove away. I didn't even take down the tent properly, just yanked up the stakes and stuffed the whole thing in the back seat. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of something large moving at the edge of our campsite. Then we rounded a bend in the road, and it was gone. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What could we say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. When we got home, Terry immediately threw up. I sat in the car for almost an hour, unable to make myself get out. The aftermath has been hard. I started having panic attacks about a week later. Terry has nightmares. We got rid of our camping gear, even gave away the canoe. I've been seeing a therapist for PTSD for the past 6 months. We did go back once, with my therapist, as part of my exposure therapy. We just drove to the parking lot, stayed in the car, and then left. Even that was almost too much. I've tried researching what we might have seen. The closest thing I can find are Bigfoot reports, but nothing about them gliding or using rafts. I've read about people feeling inexplicably tired or dizzy during encounters, though. I still don't know what to believe. All I know is that something was out there at Forlorn Lakes, something that watched us, stalked us, and tried to disable our means of escape. Something intelligent enough to build rafts and try to sink our canoe. We don't go camping anymore. We've moved to a new house, in a more urban area. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that heavy breathing outside our bedroom window. Even though we're on the second floor, whatever they were, the gliders of Forlorn Lakes, I hope I never encounter them again. But I can't shake the feeling that someday I might look out my window and see one of those bearded faces staring back at me.